Lord of Mysteries, Incarnation of Chaos by author Yu Shang Wu Wang Chuan. Chapter 231-260. Chapter 231, War Angels in the Fifth Epoch. For William I, Augustus, today was supposed to be a beautiful day. As the retired founder of the Luan Kingdom, William I usually had nothing much to do. After all, as a Sequence 1 arbiter, there weren't many things in this world that required William I's personal attention. The only thing that had recently concerned William I was their cooperation with the demonist sect and their contact with the Aurora Order. After all, these matters concerned George III's Black Emperor apotheosis ritual, which could be said to be the most important event for the Augustus family in recent years. If George III could become a Black Emperor, it would mean that Augustus could break free from the control of the seven gods and truly become one of the rulers of this world, while also increasing the Augustus family's survival rate in the apocalypse. Furthermore, if the subsequent war with the Forsac Empire went smoothly, he, as an hand of order, might even be able to advance further. The Arbiter Pathway's uniqueness was located in the Forsac Empire's God of War Church. Therefore, even though William I knew that the Ruin royal family's actions, once exposed, would draw the targeting of the three major churches, he still tacitly allowed and even promoted everything that happened. Augustus needed a Sequence 0, they had to survive the apocalypse. As for the mortals who died because of it, how could William I, as an angel, care about such ants? William I, who was enjoying his afternoon tea, looked up in a certain direction and suddenly froze. Because he saw someone who should have died, an existence that had fallen many years ago. Red Angel, Medici. That's right, before today, Medici had not directly shown himself or contacted Augustus. He had entrusted all contact work to others. Should I say long time no see? I didn't expect you, kid, to have a day where you became a Sequence 1, and even established such a kingdom with the support of Night and Storm. Hey, I guess Truncest didn't even expect you to be the final victor. The War Angel appeared from the shadows, looking down at William I from above. He greeted the other party, seemingly very intimate, yet his body language was very casual, as if he didn't take the hand of order before him seriously at all. Mr. Medici, long time no see. William I scrutinized the War Angel not far away, and the more he looked, the more alarmed he became, because he found that the War Angel in front of him seemed to be real. But how could this be? Medici had clearly fallen long ago, and even if he revived, it would be impossible for him to quietly regain the Red Priest uniqueness. Various thoughts flashed through William I's mind, but his face remained expressionless. He said, "May I ask what you intend to do with your sudden visit?" "Do what? I thought you should be very clear." The War Angel sneered, glancing at William I, then shifting his gaze elsewhere, seemingly examining the Augustus royal palace. However, no one noticed a trace of daze deep in his eyes. For the War Angel, today was a day full of dark humor. He closed his eyes and opened them again, only to find himself more than 1,000 years in the future, meeting his own future self, who was both crippled and weak. He was also told that he would soon die an unnatural death, becoming one of the hotpot ingredients for Tutor to advance to Red Priest, and the one who helped Tutor cook him was Adam. The War Angel even learned that Adam was not Adam, but the Lord's divine incarnation. To be honest, the War Angel was still in a daze. He wanted to dismiss all of this as a clumsy illusion, a provocation, but everything the War Angel encountered told him, this was real, this truly was the future, and everything his future self told him was also real. But how could this be? The War Angel couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't understand how the perfectly fine Son of God could suddenly become the Lord's divine incarnation, nor did he understand why the Lord would choose to do that. His future self had mentioned some possibilities, such as him being corrupted by the City of Calamity, and that becoming a Sequence 0 would turn him into a war-spreading machine or something, but this still couldn't dispel the War Angel's doubts. Because what the War Angel was confused about was not the Lord preventing him from becoming a Sequence 0, what the War Angel was confused about was why the Lord refused to tell him his true identity, why he didn't directly tell him the truth. If only the Lord had told him all this, he would have chosen to give up becoming a Red Priest. The War Angel was indeed ambitious, wanting to become a Sequence 0, but he was never absolutely set on becoming a Sequence 0. If there was a compelling reason to give up, for the Lord, and to prevent himself from being further corrupted, the War Angel would not mind giving up the struggle for Sequence 0, and even temporarily giving up the uniqueness and Sequence 1 characteristics was not out of the question. Then, the War Angel suddenly realized that the reason the Lord didn't tell him all this, choosing instead to directly cook him like a hot pot, was because he didn't trust him. Adam didn't believe that Medici would give up becoming a Red Priest, give up the uniqueness and Sequence 1 characteristics, out of loyalty to him or some ridiculous love for this world. As he realized all this, the War Angel suddenly felt like laughing, so he curled his lips and said with a hint of mockery, "Hey! How ridiculous." He didn't know who he was mocking. What? William I, who was pondering whether the War Angel in front of him was real or fake, looked at him with some confusion. "Isn't it ridiculous? Your squirming demeanor." The War Angel looked up at him, his smile growing more mocking, and said, "Let me guess what you're thinking now. You're confused, hesitant, questioning my authenticity, because the War Angel in your memory is already dead. I do have some doubts about your arrival." William I hesitated for a second, not completely denying it, but just said, "After all, according to the information I know, you have indeed fallen. Of course, I don't mean to question your authenticity, I'm just curious how you—" "Enough. All that talk still means you doubt my existence." The War Angel abruptly interrupted William I's words. He looked at the hand of order before him and curled a wanton smile, saying, "Whether I am the War Angel or not, we'll know after a fight." "What?" William I's pupils contracted. He said, "Wait." However, his words of protest were not yet finished when the War Angel had already made his move. For a moment, flames filled this domain. At the same time, in the alternate space meticulously crafted by Mr. Dorr, Roland and Medici were watching the show. As for Bernadette, of course, she wasn't here, she had already been sent back. "Honestly, your past self had a lot of temper," Roland commented, looking at the two angels already fighting in the projection. Chapter 232. Does God love the world? Nonsense. If you had gone through all that, wouldn't you be furious? It just means William I had bad luck, but he was an enemy anyway, so it doesn't matter. Medici glanced at him, speaking irritably, almost rolling his eyes. "You're right, if it were me, I might have dragged the world down with me." Roland nodded in understanding, then shook his head as he looked at the scene in the projection. Then, with a serious expression, he clasped his hands together in a prayer-like gesture and said, "I hope William I is okay." "Hey!" His crocodile tears made Medici let out an unceremonious laugh. His gaze returned to the War Angel in the projection, and he suddenly seemed a little lost in thought. That was a younger him, a him still full of vigor and spirit. At that time, the War Angel had not yet experienced everything that came after. No unwilling death, no forced merging with two annoying fellows, and certainly no wasting half of his life in that despairing underground structure. But Medici also clearly knew that all of this was temporary, it wouldn't be long before he would fall from the sky, plunging into the bottomless abyss. It was hard to say what kind of mood Medici was in at that moment. Medici silently watched the War Angel in the projection, who was beating William I without any chance of retaliation. He suddenly turned his head to Roland and asked, "Are you really not afraid that he might change history once he knows about these things?" "What am I afraid of?" Roland looked at him in confusion, then smiled and said, "Medici, have you forgotten? I've already said it, I welcome you all to change history, it's just a pity that no one can do what I expect right now." Sigh. Roland sighed at this point before continuing, "I'm also very curious about what would happen if such important historical nodes were changed." Medici watched him, and after confirming that the expectation in Roland's eyes was not feigned, he sneered. "You madman, you really haven't changed at all." He knew Roland was genuinely looking forward to it, even though no one could predict whether changing important past nodes would bring about a catastrophe. "Thanks for the compliment," Roland replied with a smile, then looked at Medici and said, "Don't you look forward to it?" Did he look forward to it? Medici gritted his teeth. He stared at the War Angel, who was fighting the Hand of Order, and did not answer Roland's question. Because Medici didn't know the answer to that question. He certainly hoped he could change the past of his downfall, but Medici also had a doubt in his heart. He didn't know what this world would become if he really changed the fact of his past downfall. It was laughable, really, He was a mythical angelic creature who should least care about the lives of humans, but perhaps because he had followed the Creator for too long, Medici did have a love for this world and for humanity that he himself found somewhat ridiculous. This love was imperceptible in ordinary times, but when it came to the survival of the world, it would suddenly emerge and assert its presence, which greatly annoyed Medici. But you can't abandon it. How pitiful, little Red, that past shaped you, molding you into who you are today. It might not be your true nature, but it has already become a part of your instinct. Roland spoke at this moment. He looked at Medici with a slightly pitying gaze, as if looking at a lost lamb. Don't try your trickery on me, I don't need your pity. Medici scoffed, looking at Roland. I wasn't trying to trick you, just speaking the truth. Roland shrugged, smiling as he said, as for pity. Roland paused, then suddenly chuckled and said, it's just normal concern. After all, you're one of the few good friends I have in this world. How disgusting. Medici was stunned for a moment, then showed a look of disdain. Oh right. Roland nodded perfunctorily, then turned his gaze to the projection, suddenly revealing a smile as he said, don't worry, although I'm not sure if the past you can change history, there's at least one thing I can confirm. What? Medici asked instinctively. Roland smiled and replied, even if the past you really changed history, it wouldn't truly cause any catastrophe. You can only influence the destinies of those you directly change. So don't worry, unless the past you directly merges with the primordial demoness to form a Shao Zhu, and destroy the world, it won't be a big problem. Hearing this, Medici was stunned for a moment, instinctively letting out a sigh of relief, then looked at Roland in confusion and said, you know. Just a bit of common sense. Roland smiled and glanced at him, saying, I've been digging into my memories recently. Although I haven't gained much, I have acquired some knowledge. Although Roland wasn't interested in his past as Nyarlathotep, he was very interested in the power of a little Naya. So, even if self-examination yielded no results and no new power was found, Roland would occasionally delve into his memories after discovering his true identity, to see if he could unearth anything new. The knowledge about changing history was one of Roland's gains from digging into his memories. Medici instinctively breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this, then he reacted and said, wait, since you knew, then you just. I just wanted to see your reaction. I didn't expect our great red angel to also embrace that, God loves the world kind of thing. It's truly surprising, Roland said with a smile. Tisk. Medici's expression became annoyed, but a closer look would reveal that the red angel seemed uncharacteristically flustered at this moment. He was silent for a few seconds before saying, is it strange? Probably because you don't look like the type of person who, God loves the world. Roland looked at Medici and smiled, saying, I thought you wouldn't bother with mortals. Does the proud red angel also have those insignificant ordinary people in his eyes? What about you? Medici didn't answer Roland's question. He suddenly scoffed, his ruby-like eyes looking at Roland with a sharp gaze, saying, you're clearly doing things that are, God loves the world, but do you love the world? I don't. Roland shook his head generously, smiling as he looked at Medici, saying, I thought you already knew. I never loved the world. But you still chose to save them, to save these people you don't love. Medici said, showing no surprise at Roland's answer. Because it has many benefits for me, and, although I don't love them, just like a game player hopes to get a good ending, I naturally hope my game has a good ending. Roland replied with a smile. He paused, then showed a thoughtful expression and added, from this perspective, how can it not be considered a form of love? Chapter 233 Augustus's Sliding Speed. Does Roland love this world? Definitely not. Although Roland had adjusted his mindset since Medici enlightened him last time, facing his friends with more genuine emotions instead of treating them like characters on paper, it still didn't mean Roland would love this world. He wasn't that benevolent. Even before transmigrating, Roland didn't particularly love his homeland, let alone this world he had only been in for less than 4 months. In that regard, I'm no different from you. Medici glanced at Roland, then suddenly gave a self-deprecating laugh and said, I don't love those mortals, at least not any single one of them. If it weren't for my need for a war, I might not even have gotten involved in what you're doing now. Roland watched him quietly and said, but you do love this world, love humanity. Quote. Isn't that ridiculous? Medici didn't deny it this time, just twitched his lips and said, perhaps it's because of the sun god's influence, or perhaps because they were, after all, a race I personally saved. I don't care about any specific individual among them, but I truly can't just stand by and watch them perish. Not ridiculous, just a very normal situation. Roland smiled, a nostalgic expression on his face, his eyes rarely showing a hint of remembrance as he said. I've seen many people, so many people. Some of them truly aren't good people, they're villains, liars, scum who should be locked in prison for life. But, before the apocalypse, before the extinction of their race, they still chose to step forward, chose to sacrifice themselves one after another. If not for them, I might not have made up my mind back then. Hey, Roland chuckled, not continuing. He then looked at Medici, raised his hand, and lightly tapped the air near Medici's heart, smiling as he said. Medici, you are already a human. Although you don't have a human body, you truly have a mortal heart. This is good, truly good. Medici looked at him, not denying his words. Medici just suddenly let out a scoff and asked, what about you, little monster? Do you have a mortal heart? Quote. I hope I do. Roland smiled and said, that's why I'm learning what true humanity is like, learning how to be a human. Medici watched him, and after a long while, suddenly pouted and said, how dare you even call Amon inhumane? To be fair, while there may indeed be many areas concerning humanity that I still need to learn and solidify, compared to Amon, I'm far superior to him in that regard, alright. As soon as this was said, Roland became displeased and immediately retorted. I hope so. Medici glanced at him, not a single sarcastic word, yet every letter seemed to be dripping with sarcasm. While the two in the alternate space were about to quarrel, in the real world, the battle between War Angel and William I had already concluded. Now do you believe I am the true War Angel? War Angel tidied his hair, which was slightly disheveled from the recent battle, feeling refreshed. It turns out that beating up an idiot when you're unhappy really helps relieve stress, by War Angel. Quote. Lord Medici, I never doubted your identity. William I, bruised and swollen, was not in a pleasant mood. He truly had a bitter taste in his mouth and couldn't understand why Medici was so temperamental, fighting at the drop of a hat. Was it a side effect of his fall and subsequent resurrection? William I muttered in his heart. The War Angel he remembered, though warlike, never just hit people without a word. The key was that he was just an ordinary sequence 1 of the Arbiter pathway. He truly couldn't defeat an King of Angels of the War pathway with uniqueness. William I naturally didn't know that he had simply stumbled into a bad situation. In almost any other scenario, he wouldn't have been beaten. And William I's gaze swept around, confirming that no one had come to investigate the situation. Not to mention people from the church, there weren't even any people from his own Augustus, a flash of confusion and vigilance crossing his heart. The commotion they made just now was not small. William I, worried that Medici was pretending to discuss cooperation but actually intended to kill him, hadn't helped conceal the disturbance. Logically, someone from the 3 major churches should have arrived halfway through their fight. But now, not a single person had come, as if no one had noticed the commotion here. Stop looking, this space has long been sealed, so the commotion can't get out. War Angel easily saw what William I was thinking, scoffed, and said. William I's heart tightened, and at the same time, he couldn't stop wondering, to be able to seal the space without him noticing, it had to be an angel of the door pathway, and not just any ordinary angel. But the door pathway, wasn't Mr. Door the only sequence 1? William I knew very well that this individual had unfortunately been corrupted by an outer god back in the 4th epoch and was now sealed in some alternate space. How could he possibly come to seal this area? Hey! War Angel glanced at William I, guessing what he was wondering about. He scoffed and didn't explain anything. War Angel naturally wouldn't tell William I that there was a miraculous fellow who could summon projections of people from the past, and before summoning him to negotiate with William I, he had already summoned Mr. Door to seal the space. With Mr. Door's strength, if he personally sealed the space, let alone an hand of order, even a true god might not be able to detect it. Tisk. Thinking of this, War Angel's mind couldn't help but conjure the image of that smiling, fox-like fellow standing beside his future self. What was his future self thinking, getting involved with such a guy? Wasn't he afraid of being sold out again? War Angel felt a renewed surge of irritation at this thought. He then looked at William I and said with a hint of impatience, "I don't have time to play dumb with you. You should have guessed my intentions." Augustus has always been very willing to cooperate with the Aurora Order, it's just that this matter is of great importance, so it took a bit more consideration. William I instinctively smiled at Medici, but due to pulling at his wound, the smile appeared somewhat grim. It proved that in a world where might makes right, it was truly simple for the powerful to negotiate. At least, William I, facing War Angel's fist the size of a sandbag, was very quick to concede. Of course, while it was called conceding, it wasn't entirely so. After all, William I was still a Sequence 1 and possessed the ambition and courage to push for a Sequence 0. In fact, if he wished, he could abandon the plan to create a Black Emperor right now and instantly align with the three major churches of Evernight, Storm, and Steam, becoming a close ally of the three deities once more. With such backing, William I's concessions were only on minor issues, such as agreeing readily to resources and colonies which were important to Augustus but not critically so. However, on matters of principle, such as the birth of the Black Emperor, the nature of the alliance being cooperation rather than subservience, and the division of faith, he remained unyielding. Chapter 234 The Red Angels argued. This was not strange. After all, if he truly surrendered completely, what would be the difference from being a dog? William I didn't want to continue being a dog to the three gods, which was why he wanted to introduce a Black Emperor. How could he possibly become a dog to the true creator? And after such a negotiation, it must be said that William I also achieved the results he wanted. Although he lost some benefits, he held his bottom line, and at the same time confirmed that the true creator truly wanted to cooperate with them, at least he thought so. The reason William I was so certain was mainly because he felt that the War Angel, who wanted war, and the true creator, who wanted to break the seal, had consistent interests and demands with them. People lie, but they will not betray their own interests. He was satisfied, and Roland and the others were even more satisfied. After all, William I wouldn't know that the seemingly sincere ally he believed in was merely an illusion, only coming to deceive them. People indeed do not betray their own interests, but no one has stipulated that there is only one way to gain benefits. But this couldn't be blamed on William I. Who could have imagined the existence of someone as out of line as Roland? The angels of this era also couldn't understand what it meant to strive for the happiness of the people. After the negotiation, the War Angel naturally didn't stay long in the palace. He quickly arrived at the alternate dimension where Roland and Medici were. His ruby-like eyes scanned Roland from top to bottom, then he clicked his tongue and said, "Tisk, I didn't know that my future self's judgment would be so poor. Maybe it's because you're blind." Roland didn't feel offended. He just blinked his eyes and said seriously, "After all, if your eyesight were a bit better, you wouldn't have ended up in a hot pot." The War Angel's smile instantly froze. He looked at Roland dangerously, as if studying where to start burning him with fire. "Don't look at me like that, you can't lay a hand on me." Roland wasn't afraid at all. After all, Time Shadow couldn't harm him, its summoner. He just smiled at the War Angel and said, "And with your favorability towards me, you wouldn't lay a hand on me just for a remark like that." Although Time Shadow doesn't share the memories of its future self, it does share favorability. So, even though the War Angel looked at Roland with disdain, her favorability had already quietly risen to over 80. HMPH. The War Angel scoffed, his gaze then falling on Medici, who was watching the show nearby, seemingly a bit gleeful. He snorted and said, "Why did you choose such a thing?" Medici, facing the mockery from his younger self, didn't even lift an eyelid. Instead, he nonchalantly pulled out 2 apples, handed one to Roland beside him, and started munching on the other himself, crunch, crunch. After swallowing a piece of fruit, Medici finally looked up at the War Angel, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "No choice, nowhere to go." Only this little monster was willing to take in a poor, homeless little red. Upon hearing this, the War Angel frowned, looking at Medici with disdain. "How did you become so disgusting? You were the one being sarcastic first." Medici smiled. As a true hunter, Medici clearly wouldn't be polite even when facing his past self. He said irritably, "Who are you calling blind with your constant sarcastic remarks?" "Calling you, of course." The war angel nodded unceremoniously and said, "If you're not blind, then who is? You've made yourself so crippled and weak. Honestly, I'm embarrassed to acknowledge you. Are you really my future self? You're not trying to fool me, are you?" Medici chuckled at this, not out of anger. He just glanced at the war angel and said, "Is there anything about you worth me fooling?" As he spoke, he looked left and right with a critical gaze, shaking his head as he looked. When the two red angels were together, they undoubtedly fully demonstrated the qualities of top-tier hunters, meaning, sarcasm without distinction of target. Roland, in any case, watched happily, munching on an apple. After finishing one, he pulled out a tissue, wiped his mouth, and then said, "You two stop arguing. You both are responsible for falling to your current state." The two red angels, who were mutually mocking each other, simultaneously stopped. Two incredibly similar, yet upon closer inspection, slightly different ruby eyes looked at Roland, both with ill intent. Roland himself calmly smiled at them and said, "However, I want to clarify one thing. I am a conscientious boss, so following me cannot be considered poor judgment." "Oh, a conscientious boss who works his employees to the brink of death." Medici almost rolled his eyes. "I can't help it, you know. After all, in this world, the employee I trust the most is you, Little Red. If I don't entrust those tasks to you, I wouldn't feel at ease." Roland spread his hands, saying very honestly. This was the absolute truth. Although Roland had recruited many people to join the Leziran Club, existences like Mr. Door, for one, he didn't trust them that much, and for another, their state wasn't suitable for work. In the end, these tasks could only be given to Medici. Medici glanced at Roland upon hearing this. Seeing his seriousness, he clicked his tongue and said, "That's truly a heavy trust." Roland blinked, then suddenly changed the subject, saying, "And in this matter, Little Red, don't you also bear some responsibility?" "Huh?" Medici looked at Roland, his face practically screaming, "Let's see how you're going to turn the tables." Roland, however, said righteously, "As the saying goes, if you can't lead a team, you'll work yourself to death. Since I'm quite good at leading a team, I can be carefree, but you, Little Red, do everything yourself, not knowing how to cultivate trusted subordinates to share the work. Of course, you'll be tired." Medici finally rolled his eyes upon hearing this, saying irritably, "Is there a possibility that I am cultivating trusted subordinates? Otherwise, who do you think is usually in charge of the base? It's just that a certain someone assigns me tasks too quickly, and they're basically in different fields. The speed at which I cultivate trusted subordinates simply can't keep up with the speed at which you assign tasks. Do you think everyone is like me, capable of holding multiple positions?" "Ah, well." Roland, upon hearing this, rarely showed a slightly guilty smile, then thought of something and looked seriously at Medici, saying, "Don't worry, Little Red, for your early liberation, I will definitely poach Saussure. Then you'll be relaxed." Medici rolled his eyes again and said, "Go ahead and poach him. If you can, you're amazing." The war angel suddenly spoke at this moment, asking, "Saussure? You don't know, do you? This guy has been coveting Saussure for a long time, always wanting to poach Saussure to work for him." Medici glanced at his past self, not hiding anything, and said, "I admire his determination in this regard." Chapter 235 Two Plans to Rescue the Sun God. Because Saussure is truly very useful. He was able to manage the Sun God's divine kingdom in perfect order back then. If he were to switch to my team, he would definitely be worth 3 Little Reds alone, Roland said with conviction, his expression showing no trace of guilt. Then how could you be so shameless as to use an 8-hour workday to sow discord between Saussure and the Sun God? Medici said, annoyed. With your personality, even if Saussure switched over, he'd still be working 24/7. Roland's gaze immediately drifted, as if he had suddenly discovered that this alien space different dimension was particularly different space different dimension. After several seconds, he quietly retorted, "At least I'd give him annual leave." The war angel finally couldn't help but speak again. "Is there a possibility that Saussure went mad after becoming the true creator and can't help you manage things? And he has already merged with the Lord's humanity. Roland looked at him strangely upon hearing this and said, "Is there a possibility that a mad deity can regain sanity, and that which is merged can split again?" The war angel's gaze instantly sharpened. Medici also looked at Roland. He narrowed his eyes and said, "So that's what you're planning." Medici had been very curious before about how Roland planned to poach Saussure to help, now that Saussure had fallen and become the true creator. He just hadn't asked until now, and only now did he understand some of Roland's thoughts. "I can only say they are some thoughts. I like to ponder things when I'm bored, so I've also thought about plans to salvage a creator." Roland spread his hands, then enthusiastically said, "Currently, I have two plans. One is to separate and then merge. It's well known that Atom plus true creator equals ancient sun god plus Saussure. So, by purifying the consciousnesses of the two existing ones and then merging them, perhaps the ancient sun god and Saussure can be recombined, and I might even be able to get the true Atom. However, the difficulty with this plan is how to purify the consciousness. I have some ideas about this, but currently, there isn't a particularly mature plan." Roland paused here, sighed, and said, "After all, my specialty isn't quite right." Roland's abilities, in the end, primarily specialize in several aspects: time and space, emotion manipulation, and incarnation. Among these, the only one related to consciousness is emotion manipulation. But even a persona mask can at most attach a certain emotion to Atom or perhaps the true creator. It's impossible for Roland to reverse purify the consciousness of the ancient sun god and Saussure that he desires. However, considering that Roland is currently only sequence 6, it's not certain whether new abilities related to emotion and consciousness will appear in later sequences, so he believes this plan still has some possibility of realization. What about the second plan? Medici didn't comment on Roland's plan, but asked. The second plan, Roland paused here, revealing a smile, and said, "It's simple yet difficult. It's well known that Time Shadow can summon people from the past. So, if I summon the ancient sun god and Saussure a second before their fall, and keep their consciousnesses in this era, how can that not be considered a form of resurrection?" Medici was stunned. He almost subconsciously clenched his fists and said, "Can you do it?" "Not yet." Roland shook his head and said very honestly, "If I could do it now, I would have resurrected Saussure to work for me long ago." A very real reason, convincing. Medici suddenly felt a sense of loss. Even though he no longer pledged allegiance to the sun god, he still had very deep feelings for the sun god and for Saussure, and naturally hoped for their resurrection. The war angel's reaction was no better than Medici's. He looked at Roland and asked, "But you seem to have a direction." "I do have some ideas. Perhaps after I advance to sequence 2, I can try this path," Roland smiled and said. Roland still hadn't fully understood what a fictionalist's abilities truly were, but through his self-exploration, Roland had vaguely gained some understanding. The fictionalist's ability seemed to indeed be able to forcibly keep a consciousness summoned from the past in the present era, though with significant limitations. Of course, Roland still wasn't entirely clear on the specifics, but he was very much looking forward to it. Hearing Roland's words, the war angel was somewhat puzzled. After all, although he shared emotions and exchanged some information with his future self, he still didn't understand Roland too well. Medici narrowed his eyes. He suddenly said, "How much more of the sequence 6 potion do you need to digest?" "About a month." Roland reported a number uncertainly. The manifestation of the Lucifer persona was going very smoothly. At his current pace, he would obtain a sequence 2 persona in just 1 month. However, even after digesting the sequence 6 potion, I still need to complete the ritual and obtain the auxiliary materials for concocting the scriptwriter potion before I can advance, Roland said with a smile. Just as other pathways in this world require an auxiliary ritual to advance to sequence 5, Roland's advancement to sequence 5 scriptwriter also requires completing a ritual. However, the content of the ritual is very simple for Roland: to temporarily control the fate of over 1,000 people, make them generate intense emotions, and drink the potion while surrounded by these intense emotions. To be honest, this ritual would be hellishly difficult for other sequence 6s to complete, but for Roland, the people of either City of Silver or Moon City are enough for him to complete the ritual. As long as Roland selects 1,000 people from City of Silver and Moon City and brings them to the outside world, it will perfectly meet the requirement of controlling fate, and the emotions these 1,000 people generate the moment they see the bright world will be enough to satisfy the subsequent needs. This is also why Roland is so invested in the matters of City of Silver. While converting the Lucifer persona as soon as possible is one thing, the most crucial part is that City of Silver is truly a very useful ritual tool. As for the auxiliary materials needed to concoct the scriptwriter potion, they follow the consistent style of the Chaos Pathway potion formulas. This time, it's the Earth and Moon pathway's turn, requiring relevant items from a high sequence of the Earth or Moon pathway. To be honest, Roland's current conventional idea for this is to ask Lilith for some blood. His less conventional idea is to try to see if the Mother Goddess of Depravity's contamination would work. Medici naturally didn't know what suicidal thoughts Roland had. Upon hearing Roland's words, he instinctively frowned and said, "Too slow. To be fair, just over 3 months ago, I was still immortal. This speed is already like cheating, okay." Roland didn't think his advancement speed was slow and said righteously, "Have some patience, Little Red. I can understand your desire to see your mother soon, but you also have to consider me." Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 236. Amon was beaten again. Tisk. Medici clicked his tongue, a hint of annoyance in his voice, but he didn't refute Roland's words. After all, he knew very well that Roland's advancement speed was already quite fast. As for the comment about wanting to see Mom, Medici simply ignored it. Medici, accustomed to Roland's various outrageous remarks, could ignore his nonsense, but the War Angel from the 4th epic evidently wasn't familiar with someone's style. He paused, eyes widening slightly, when he heard Roland's words. Then, he looked at Roland, whose expression was perfectly natural, and then at Medici, who seemed accustomed to it. Finally, he said with some incredulity, "You just let him talk nonsense like that?" Before Medici could speak, Roland became displeased. He argued, "How can it be nonsense? Sasria is indeed your adoptive mother, Little Red. Sasria herself admitted it. Sasria just couldn't argue with you." Medici rolled his eyes, saying irritably, "Doesn't that mean she agreed with my point?" Roland showed no embarrassment whatsoever, smiling as he looked at the War Angel, whose expression was surprised and clearly shocked by this fact. He said, "Little Red, you don't need to be embarrassed, I understand everything." War Angel, what do you understand? All right, you understand everything." Medici rolled his eyes. As an old hand, he didn't argue with Roland. Then he looked at the War Angel, and, not knowing what he thought of, said, "I don't know if you can change your predetermined fate. In any case, be careful from now on." It was clear that Medici probably had a lot he wanted to say, but in the end, those words converged into a single, "Be careful." I know, the War Angel no longer dwelled on the issue of how to address Sasria. Thinking of his impending fate, a hint of gloom appeared in his eyes. "Don't be so serious. Although your fate of being boiled in a hot pot, Little Red, is hard to change, if you think positively, knowing this fate beforehand means you can at least report it to the true Creator in advance. That way, when you die and become a wraith, Ouroboros can still visit you from time to time, so you won't be too bored." Roland raised an eyebrow, seeing the atmosphere become heavy again, and said with a smile, "While important fate nodes are hard to change, these insignificant little details are very easy to alter. You could even set up a circus to perform for you daily in the underground mausoleum." That's truly a good suggestion. The War Angel's mouth twitched. Right. If you're really bored, I can even ask Mr. Door to send you his gossip writings every day. Honestly, I've wanted those books for a long time, but unfortunately, I can only see incomplete versions now. You should be secretly happy that you can read the complete version." Roland didn't think there was anything wrong with his suggestion, and said with a smile, "After all, life must go on. If you can't change the current situation, then make yourself as comfortable as possible. And to think even more optimistically, you're not going to be like this for the rest of your life. After enduring more than 1,000 years, a wise and mighty boss will naturally descend from the heavens to save you from your predicament. Thinking about it this way, don't you feel like there's something to look forward to?" "Wise and mighty, who?" Medici, standing nearby, showed a puzzled expression, looking at Roland and asking sincerely, "You?" Not a single word was sarcastic, yet every word dripped with sarcasm. "What, am I, your boss, not wise and mighty enough?" Roland showed no embarrassment whatsoever, exuding pure confidence. "As long as you're happy." Medici, having spent a long time with Roland, had clearly already built up a vast vocabulary of sarcastic remarks. He then scrutinized Roland from head to toe, shook his head, and sighed, saying, "Alas, life truly is becoming more and more hopeless. If you're feeling hopeless, I suggest you hang yourself from the southeast branch." Roland didn't humor him, saying with a smile, "I wouldn't mind hanging myself from the southeast branch, but I'm afraid a certain black-hearted organization would collapse on the spot without me," Medici said with a scoff, crossing his arms. "No worries, if you kick the bucket, I can still drag you over to help. Anyway, you're not expensive, and my current spirituality can totally afford you," Roland said with a smile. The two individuals, both with maxed-out sarcasm skills, thus engaged in a back-and-forth exchange of insults, fully demonstrating the basic qualities of a top hunter, and what it means for the good hunter prospects to be in other pathways. Watching the two of them bicker, the War Angel, who had been ignored, found his initially heavy mood considerably lightened. He glanced at Medici, then at Roland, and suddenly smiled, saying, "All right, stop arguing, both of you." Then the War Angel first looked at Medici and said, "See, this is the consequence of being blind. It's useless for you to deny it." He then looked at Roland and said, "Admit it, you're a black-hearted boss, destined to be strung up." Instantly, the War Angel attracted the enmity of both individuals. However, the War Angel paused, looking at Roland, and added, "Your suggestion does have some merit. Life indeed must go on, hey?" "Of course." Roland raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "But you adjusted faster than I expected. I thought you'd cry and make a fuss for a while. Even Ouroboros wouldn't cry and make a fuss when something happens. Do you take me for some fragile porcelain doll?" The War Angel scoffed, then looked at Medici and said, "I no longer doubt your identity." "You shouldn't have doubted it in the first place." Medici glanced at him, and asked. Roland then pulled out his pocket watch and glanced at it, then looked at the War Angel and said, "You have 5 minutes left. Do you want to wander around this era, or meet some acquaintances?" The War Angel chose not to wander around in this unfamiliar era, perhaps because he wasn't interested, or perhaps simply because 5 minutes was too short to explore anything. In short, he very decisively chose to meet an acquaintance. He found the nearest Amon clone and then beat him up. "No, Medici, are you sick? What did I do to provoke you?" The Amon clone, who had just started working in Backland and was brutally beaten, cursed, holding his head full of bumps. The War Angel patted the dust off his clothes, not explaining anything, only feeling refreshed. Even his fists felt stronger. Although Amon wasn't the main culprit behind his hotpot fate, he was an accomplice. Just beating him up was letting him off easy. The War Angel didn't think there was anything wrong with his actions. Roland and Medici appeared from the alternate space. The former curiously poked the bump on Amon's head, while the latter showed a gloating smile. "2. Tisk, I knew something felt off with the strength. So it's the Medici from the past." The Amon clone paused when he saw the two red angels in front of him, then reacted and clicked his tongue. Just as he was about to say something more, he suddenly gasped, "Hiss, gently. Even though I'm just a clone, I still feel pain." It turned out Roland poked too hard. "Why are you here? I thought there were no other Amon clones in Backland besides Little Amon. Are you planning something bad?" Roland asked curiously. He wasn't nervous facing this unfamiliar Amon clone. After all, if it came down to it, Amon should be the one who's nervous. Chapter 237, Mutated Amon's Clone. "You've got it all wrong." As soon as Roland said that, the Amon clone immediately cried out, "How could I have any bad intentions? I'm just a poor little clone enslaved by my main body. I would never dare to have any bad intentions, ho." Roland raised an eyebrow, his gaze towards the Amon clone before him becoming a little more curious. After all, these words, a normal Amon clone really couldn't say them. Has it evolved or mutated? Then tell me, what are you doing in Backland? Roland asked with a smile. The reason I came to Backland is for you, Lucifer. The suspected mutated Amon clone rummaged in its pocket and pulled out a small booklet. When opened, it was filled with various, Lucifer's little stories. After you asked the main body to help publicize your deeds, the main body assigned tasks to us clones. Other places were fine, but Backland is your private territory, and everyone was a bit afraid to come over, so, the suspected mutated Amon clone showed a look of indignation when it said this, and continued, everyone held another full Amon referendum, and it turned out they cheated. Poor me just became the scapegoat, cough, in short, I'm here to help you, Lucifer. Roland heard this, glanced at the Amon clone, and smiled. He didn't say whether he believed it or not. He just chuckled and patted the Amon clone's head, making the latter wince in pain, then said, keep it up, do well. He didn't care if Amon had any ill intentions. Roland had already taken all necessary precautions. Not only did he make Amon sign a contract under the witness of his biological father, but to be safe, he also asked Mr. Dorr to help leave protections on Klein and others. If Amon really wasn't honest, he could just wait for his biological father's iron fist. Roland then looked at War Angel and said, time's almost up. See you next time, Medici. I didn't expect to see such a good show before I left. War Angel withdrew his gaze from the Amon clone and then fixed it on Roland, curling his lips, I hope next time we meet, someone will have a bit more self-awareness. Don't be silly, I'm always very self-aware, alright. Roland glanced at him, then looked at Medici, don't you have anything to say? What is there to say? Medici looked up at War Angel, who immediately met his gaze. Two nearly identical pairs of red eyes stared at each other, and finally, both snorted with laughter, neither speaking again. Roland shook his head at the sight and said nothing more, canceling the summoning of War Angel. Fourth epic. War Angel opened his eyes. Before him was a familiar scene. He had returned to his own era. Everything just now seemed like an illusion, but War Angel clearly knew it was not a dream. What's wrong, Medici? Ouroboros's slightly puzzled voice sounded beside him. Only then did War Angel remember what he was doing before. He was discussing with the Great Serpent and the Creator about hunting Sauron and Einhorn next. Of course, it was called a discussion, but in reality, it was War Angel unilaterally stating his plan, because you really couldn't expect Ouroboros, this silly snake, to offer any useful suggestions. As for True Creator, no matter how much War Angel respected the Creator, he couldn't deny that the Creator was often in a state of madness at this time. Although True Creator in this era could control himself most of the time due to the sufficient number of anchors, and wouldn't harm others, unlike in later generations where his madness directly caused believers to lose their minds through ravings, one really couldn't expect such a Creator to devise strategies. War Angel's gaze lingered on True Creator for a moment, then he lowered his eyes. He hadn't truly experienced the hot pot incident yet, so he wasn't like the future Medici, who didn't know how to face True Creator. But after knowing such a future in advance, even War Angel couldn't say that his mood wasn't complicated when facing the Creator now. But War Angel ultimately said nothing and did nothing. He just looked at Fate Angel Ouroboros and suddenly said, Great Serpent, can you see my fate? Ouroboros was stunned for a moment, then looked at War Angel very seriously. A few seconds later, he shook his head and said, I can't see clearly. Although the fate pathway has a certain predictive ability, its limitations are actually quite significant. One cannot see anyone's future just by wanting to. At least at this moment, Fate Angel Ouroboros truly couldn't see Medici's future. War Angel was not surprised by this result. He just thought a little distractedly about everything he had just seen in the future. Even Lord of the Mysteries probably doesn't possess such power, War Angel made an assessment in his heart. He suddenly thought of something else and smiled. Conscientious boss, hey. Roland didn't make things difficult for the suspected mutated Amon clone, nor was there any need to. After all, even without mentioning the protections Roland had set up in the Sun God's fist, which was as big as a sandbag, just considering Amon's characteristic, that if one clone is found, Amon might already be everywhere, Roland had no need to make things difficult for an obvious Amon clone. Moreover, Roland believed Amon was a smart person, and smart people wouldn't do things that challenged his bottom line. So Roland simply said goodbye to the Amon clone, sent Medici back to work, and then returned to the alternate space to catch up on sleep. After Roland and Medici left, the Amon clone, left behind, also breathed a sigh of relief. That was close, that was close. I thought I was dead for sure this time. The Amon clone patted its chest with lingering fear, put away the booklet titled, Lucifer's Little Stories, then slowly took off its monocle and wiped it. As it wiped, it mused, I didn't detect any combat just now. Bethel must have helped seal the space, is it a secret that can't be known by others? It required a war angel to act. Given the current situation in Backland, Augustus. A thoughtful glint flashed in the Amon clone's eyes. It curled its lips, thinking of the information it had recently gathered, and smiled. If William really fell, even if the space was sealed perfectly, Augustus or the three major churches should have reacted by now. So it was just a fight. Recently, the Aurora Order has indeed been making some unusual moves, actively contacting the Ruin royal family. So, is this to demonstrate strength? Interesting. With Father's style, it's impossible for him to truly cooperate with Augustus, so, a scam. The Amon clone shook its head at this point, then made a show of drawing a cross on its chest and said, I hope Augustus is okay. Then the Amon clone raised a hand to touch the bump on its head, gasped, and sighed, what an undeserved calamity. If it really had any bad intentions, then taking this beating would be fine, but the truth was, it really wasn't planning to do anything recently. The main body sent it to Backland simply to observe the growth state of the little Amon and to observe the situation in Backland. Speaking of little Amon, the Amon clone's expression became strange, and it murmured, with their child-rearing method, can they really gain humanity? The Amon clone was very skeptical. Chapter 238 Educating Little Amon. Roland naturally didn't know that their method of raising little Amon had been tampered with by an Amon clone. If he had known, he would have cursed back without hesitation. After Roland had a good nap in the alternate dimension and tidied himself up, he began to ponder a question: who should be in charge of the biological laboratory? The workaholic Medici could be ruled out first. Regardless of suitability, considering Medici's current workload, even Roland, the black-hearted boss, couldn't bear to assign such a huge task to him. But besides Medici, I really don't have anyone else available. If Rosal had already been rescued, I could let him oversee both the mechanical laboratory and the biological laboratory, tisk. Roland sighed with a bit of annoyance, pinching his chin and pondering for a while before remembering a candidate. How about letting Will try? Although Snake of Fate might be completely clueless about biological experiments, firstly, Will's character was guaranteed. Entrusting the laboratory to him meant at least not having to worry about him intentionally causing trouble. Secondly, the good luck brought by Snake of Fate was exactly what the experiments needed. Sometimes, when conditions in other aspects were not met, a little good luck could greatly shorten the time required for an experiment. Thirdly, with the restart ability, even if something went wrong with the laboratory, such as a mushroom zombie war breaking out, it could be reset with one click. Besides, if I don't use Will in this area, I don't really have any other places where I desperately need him. It feels like a great waste to not use the only Snake of Fate I have. Thinking this, Roland made a decision. He immediately returned home and saw Will teaching little Amon about ritual magic. It was clear that little Amon was listening very carefully, even taking notes, just like a truly good student. Roland glanced at him, then raised an eyebrow and said, "Are the clothes a bit small?" It's common knowledge that children grow at an astonishing rate, with clothes that fit one day possibly being too small the next. This was especially true for little Amon. After all, he truly aged a year each day. Today was little Amon's 10th day at home. Compared to the childishness of the past few days, little Amon looked somewhat like a teenager today, having developed quite well, almost comparable to a normal 13 or 14-year-old child. Will, his teacher, who was originally taller than him, now looked much shorter. We didn't anticipate such a big change in little Amon from 9 to 10 years old, so the clothes were bought for a normal 10-year-old. They are indeed a little small. Ask walked over from the side, holding a cup of coffee. After taking a sip, he said, "I originally wanted to go buy new clothes, but little Amon refused. He really likes the one he's wearing now." Roland glanced at the clothes little Amon was wearing. It was a magician-themed outfit. To say it was small wasn't entirely accurate. The clothes weren't tight, only the sleeves were a bit short, revealing a section of his wrist, but it didn't look bad at all. No wonder Amon's true body dresses like a magician every day. So he just likes this style. Roland internally complained, maintaining a slight smile on his face. Little Amon naturally heard their conversation. He turned his head to look at the two of them and said seriously, I really like these clothes, and if I only wear them for one day, there's no need to change. They don't make me uncomfortable at all. Waste is wrong. Hearing little Amon's words, Roland raised an eyebrow. He then reached out and ruffled his head, asking with a smile, did Sherlock teach you that? Besides Klein, Roland really couldn't think of anyone else in this house who would teach little Amon that waste was shameful. Ahem. Little Amon nodded vigorously, then seemed to think of something, showing a hesitant expression, but then becoming firm again. He then reached out and grabbed Roland's clothes, saying, Uncle Lucifer, do you dislike Brother Sherlock? Roland was stunned for a moment upon hearing this. He then looked at little Amon with interest, smiling as he said, I can't really say I like him very much. This was the plain truth. Although Roland himself definitely considered Klein a good friend, Lucifer had always disliked Klein. This was also a distinction Roland deliberately made to prevent Jack and Lucifer's personas from being too similar. But Brother Sherlock is really good, little Amon said, looking at Roland with his black eyes, sounding a little pitiful, please don't dislike him, okay? Although he looked pitiful on the surface, as if he was about to cry any second, if one looked closely, they would find a well-hidden cunning beneath the surface of that pity. Clearly, little Amon knew exactly what he was doing. He was deliberately using his advantage as a child to try and win Roland's sympathy, thereby achieving the result he wanted. PFF'd. Roland finally couldn't hold back his laughter. He looked at little Amon, who seemed a bit flustered by his reaction and didn't know how to continue acting. He reached out again and ruffled little Amon's head, smiling as he said, Sorry, no. Although Uncle really wants to agree to little Amon's request, this is a matter of principle, so Uncle cannot agree. But, little Amon was clearly not satisfied with this result and said persistently, Brother Jack also really likes Brother Sherlock, so why doesn't Uncle Lucifer like Brother Sherlock? Roland's smile grew even brighter upon hearing this. He then tidied little Amon's ruffled hair before saying, But in this world, there's no rule that if a student has a good relationship with someone, the teacher must also have a good relationship with that person, is there? Just like you, Roland withdrew his hand and continued, in this family, you don't have equally good relationships with everyone, do you? At least you don't particularly like me. Little Amon froze for a moment, probably not expecting Roland to say that. He stood rooted to the spot, looking somewhat at a loss. And I won't force you to like me, nor will I think there's anything wrong with you not liking me, Roland continued. He half squatted down and met little Amon's gaze, saying, This is my principle for dealing with people. It may not be entirely correct, but I still hope you can understand that feelings are never forced. In this world, there's no rule that just because you're pitiful, you can force others to like someone else. Upon hearing this, little Amon lowered his head, not knowing if he was feeling wronged or if he was deep in thought. Is it really okay to say all this to a child? Will's voice came from the side. He had already put down the textbook in his hand, looking at little Amon, then at Roland, and said, he might just simply want Sherlock to be happy. Chapter 239 Luo Lin's view of right and wrong. He's not an ordinary child. In a few days, he'll be an adult. Even now, his mind is far more mature than that of a typical child. So, in this situation, it's even more crucial not to indulge him, or else, with a slight misstep, he might be completely led astray and impossible to correct. Roland shook his head, glanced at little Amon, and then smiled, saying, But I'm truly surprised you have such a good relationship with Sherlock. It's good that you're willing to do things to make Sherlock happy, but your method is wrong. Then what's right? Little Amon suddenly looked up at Roland, his expression very serious, even showing a hint of stubbornness, as if he was very concerned about the answer to this question. Right and wrong are very difficult concepts to define, and in this matter, Roland paused here, probably taking some time to consider how to explain it to little Amon, before continuing. You can give Sherlock advice, you can help him do things that will improve his relationship with me, and you can also use other things to distract Klein, so he no longer considers this aspect. Little Amon showed a thoughtful expression, which made him look less like a 10-year-old child and more like a miniature adult. So, doing the right thing can't be based on going against others' wishes, right? Little Amon suddenly said after thinking for a while. Partially right. I just said that right and wrong are very difficult concepts to define. Sometimes, due to different positions, what's right can become wrong, and some mistakes, in specific situations, can become a form of correctness. However, this part of the concept is indeed too early for you. Roland nodded, then shook his head, and finally smiled, saying, "For you right now, just remember what you just said." Little Amon probably didn't fully understand, nodding somewhat ignorance, and then, after hesitating for a while, little Amon suddenly spoke. "I'm sorry." Roland was stunned for a moment, truly surprised this time. He then curved his lips into a smile and said, "I forgive you. Little Amon is a good child. A child who knows his mistakes and corrects them is the best child." After speaking, Roland took a candy from his pocket and handed it to little Amon, then patted his head and said, "Go rest for a bit. I have some things to discuss with your teacher, Will." "Oh." Little Amon took the candy, stood up without hesitation, and scurried away. "You actually know how to teach children." Will, who had witnessed the entire scene, couldn't help but retort, "I thought, given your style, you'd directly state that your own wishes are paramount and others' wishes don't matter at all." "Of course, that's how I am," Roland admitted without any embarrassment, which left Will momentarily speechless. Roland continued to smile, saying, "But it's not that I don't know what's right, even though I may not necessarily adhere to that rightness. But this is about teaching Amon, so of course, I'll teach him in the best way possible. After all, Amon's values are already quite skewed. If they aren't corrected for the better, what kind of person would he turn out to be?" "You are quite frank," Will couldn't help but exclaim again. Roland glanced at him, smiled, and said nothing more. Will then thought of something, looked at him, and asked, "Is there something you need me for?" "It's like this." Roland didn't beat around the bush, quickly explained the matter of the biological laboratory, and finally said, "So, after comprehensive consideration, I want to entrust the biological laboratory to your care." "Huh?" Will was stunned for a moment. He pointed to himself with his finger and said in surprise, "Me? But I don't understand anything about this at all." "You don't need to understand these things. I'll entrust professional matters to professionals. Will, you just need to coordinate them." Roland shook his head and said. "But why me?" Will heard Roland's words and continued to ask with some hesitation. "Because I can only trust you, Will." Roland's tone was very sincere. He looked at Will and said, "The biological laboratory is very important, it concerns the future of humanity. I truly can't rest assured in trusting it to anyone else. And you'll rest assured in trusting it to me." Will pursed his lips and said, "We've only known each other for a few days, right? But even before we met, I already knew what kind of person you are, Will." Roland looked at him with a smile, saying, "I believe that someone who would give up asking Klein for help in accommodating the uniqueness because Klein was in a bad state is a friend I can trust." Will fell silent for a few seconds after hearing this, then puffed out his cheeks and said, all right, I'll help then. "Anyway, I was going to work for you, but let me say this first, I really have no experience in biological experiments. At most, I can manage the laboratory well for you. Don't expect anything else." "That's perfectly fine." Roland's smile brightened a bit. He paused, then smiled again and said, "Actually, even if you don't understand anything, Will, you might still be able to help with the experiments." "Huh?" Will immediately looked at him, puzzled. In the field of scientific research, knowledge and strength are very important, but luck is also an indispensable part. Roland then smiled and explained to Will several things that were invented due to luck, finally concluding, "So, Will, you just need to occasionally give those researchers some good luck, and you'll play a big role." Will raised an eyebrow after listening, then suddenly said, "You didn't calculate this long ago, did you?" "What?" Roland looked at him with a smile. "You must have calculated this long ago." Will, however, seemed to have found the answer in his smile, saying, "No wonder you didn't need my luck, but still, so you were waiting for me here." "Is Will angry?" Roland neither admitted nor denied, only asked, "Why would I be angry? We are partners, and it's normal to need each other's help, isn't it?" Will looked at him in confusion, then sighed and said, "It's just that I didn't expect you to want me to do this. Tisk, I originally thought it was just about helping with a fight. Sigh, I feel like the responsibility on my shoulders has suddenly become heavy. Will is a good person, at least among angels, he belongs to the lawful alignment." Precisely because of this, now that he has become responsible for the biological laboratory, Will indeed feels some immense pressure. Roland naturally saw what Will was troubled about. He didn't feel embarrassed about it. After all, if Will were an irresponsible person, he wouldn't have entrusted the biological laboratory to him. Roland simply said, "Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Although the biological laboratory is entrusted to you, even if the laboratory ultimately doesn't research anything, no one can be blamed. Life will always find its way, and even if the biological ascension path is blocked, we can still find other paths." Chapter 240 People in Silver City are studying. You don't need to comfort me. I'm not so narcissistic as to think I can bear the future of humanity. Will shook his head, then looked at Roland with the gaze reserved for precious creatures, and said, "I just didn't expect that you clearly don't care about humanity, yet you seem to desire the advancement of humanity more than anyone. Why is that?" When Roland and Rosal discussed related issues before, Will had actually wanted to ask that. Sometimes he really couldn't understand why Roland did what he did. "I just find it interesting." Roland's answer was unexpectedly simple. He looked at Will and said with a smile, "This world is very special, at least more special than many worlds I know. So I'm very curious what kind of path humanity can forge in such a special world. Perhaps this is a kind of nurturing joy." Speaking of this, Roland suddenly thought of something and smiled. At this moment, he suddenly felt he was a bit like Nyarlathotep. After all, in Roland's understanding, Nyarlathotep sometimes did such things, promoting technological progress, human development, and then letting humanity self-destruct. No, delete that last sentence. Roland shook his head, still a little shaken. He was a good Nyarlathotep, absolutely couldn't do such a thing. Why do I feel like you're suddenly a little guilty? Are you planning something bad? Will suddenly spoke. No, it's your illusion. Roland denied it without thinking, then said with a smile. The establishment of the biological laboratory will take some time. I will help you during this period, but once the laboratory is officially established, it will be your responsibility. Although Augustus had agreed to hand over several colonial islands to them, the handover itself would take time. Not to mention Roland also needed to purchase various supplies for the laboratory and recruit scientific researchers. A huge laboratory couldn't just have Frank alone. Even establishing the laboratory itself required time. Not just the laboratory. Considering that I have at most 1 month until I advance to Sequence 5, since the colony is acquired, it's time to establish a new city of silver in the outside world, otherwise, people will be relocated without a place to live. It's a pity that none of the pathways seem particularly suitable for civil engineering. Roland thought of this and shook his head slightly regretfully, beginning to ponder which construction teams to hire. A month's time was a bit rushed, but if enough money was paid, it might not be too late. As for the potential dangers of moving in immediately after renovation, that was easily solved. Will naturally didn't know where Roland's thoughts had wandered, and he had no objection to Roland's arrangements, nodding his head. So Roland rushed out again, this time arriving at Generous City. When Roland arrived, Colin Iliad and others were learning the common language of the continent with Amon. It was clear that, except for a few exceptionally gifted individuals, most were struggling greatly. This was normal. After all, apart from little son Derek, there were no very young people among those who came from City of Silver and Moon City. They were basically all adults, whose learning ability was naturally inferior to that of children, and they generally didn't have pathways with learning ability bonuses like a seer. Learning a new language was naturally difficult. But even so, not a single person slacked off. No matter how painful the learning was, they all gritted their teeth and studied diligently. Roland didn't disturb them either. He quietly watched for a while, and only appeared after the class ended, smiling and saying, "I was worried that Amon wasn't a good teacher, but now it seems I overthought it. He teaches quite well, at least." Colin Iliad was stunned for a moment, then immediately reacted, turning around. Upon seeing Roland, Colin Iliad quickly bowed and said, "Good day, Your Highness Lucifer." After bowing, Colin Iliad pondered for a moment before saying, "His Highness Amon is a very good teacher. He has taught us many things during this time." Anyway, it was a flurry of praise. Amon also looked at Roland. He raised his hand and pinched the monocle on his face, smiling and saying, "Since I promised Father I would take good care of them, I naturally wouldn't be half-hearted. I can see that, Amon, you really are a daddy's boy. Roland commented with a laugh, then looked at Colin Iliad and asked some questions, including but not limited to, how are the people of City of Silver and Moon City getting along? And, are there any issues with adapting to the new environment? After confirming that both sides were getting along harmoniously, had no conflicts with the local people of the 5 Seas, and no one was getting sick from not adapting to the new environment, so everything was fine, Roland nodded with satisfaction and said. Regarding the relocation site for the people of City of Silver and Moon City after leaving the forsaken land of the gods, I have already resolved it. You can prepare to establish your true new home in this world. As soon as these words were spoken, Amon, who was standing nearby, raised an eyebrow, and the expressions of the people from the forsaken land of the gods, including Colin Iliad, couldn't help but show some excitement. This wasn't because they had been living poorly during this time. On the contrary, both the people of City of Silver and Moon City felt as if they were living in a legendary divine kingdom during this period. They lived in houses they had never seen before, ate delicious food that made them want to swallow their tongues, and wore strange but beautiful clothes. Even the most imaginative among them had never dreamed they would one day live such a life. But precisely because of this, it made them feel even more urgent, hoping to bring out the rest of the people from City of Silver and Moon City as soon as possible, so they would no longer live in that place of only darkness, only monsters and black-faced grass. Of course, no one would blame Roland. Everyone just worked hard in silence, preparing for the main group to come out later, and praying in their hearts for that day to arrive soon. Thank you very much, Your Highness Lucifer. Colin Iliad suppressed his excitement and said, is there anything we can help with? Although a station has been secured, there are no suitable houses for you there, so I will arrange for people to help you build your residences. You will be responsible for this aspect of the work, and I will arrange for the construction team to follow your instructions. Roland looked at Colin Iliad and said unhurriedly, in a month, I will bring out the second batch of people, numbering around 1,000, so you need to prepare in advance before then. Roland did not plan to bring out all the people from City of Silver and Moon City at once. After all, receiving everyone at once would be a huge challenge for the outside world, and it would be easy for problems to arise if there was a slight mistake. It was better to do it in batches. I understand, Your Highness Lucifer. I will arrange everything in advance. Colin Iliad said firmly, his hands at his sides unconsciously clenching. A team of 1,000 people was not as easy to arrange as just a few of them. Issues such as housing, food, clothing, and language all needed to be resolved. Chapter 241 Azek's Positivity. Fortunately, Colin Iliad had been preparing for this since the first day he arrived in the outside world. In these days, he had already connected with several Beander circles through Amon's channels, exchanged the characteristics of City of Silver for a large sum of gold pounds, and purchased a large amount of food and supplies. At least, settling a team of 1,000 people in a short period would definitely not be a problem. And with the quality of the people from City of Silver and Moon City, once the initial problems were solved, the rest would actually be simple. They were not delicate flowers in a greenhouse. Every survivor from City of Silver or Moon City was in existence who had fought against monsters. After overcoming the most difficult initial period, even children could be self-sufficient. Roland smiled with satisfaction upon hearing Colin Iliad's answer. He did not intend to give the other party too much help in this regard. After all, he was not a nanny. Being able to help the people of City of Silver and Moon City leave the forsaken land of the gods and helping them secure accommodation was already the limit. If the remaining part still required Roland's help with everything, then how was he any different from raising a group of useless people? But this did not mean Roland would completely wash his hands of the matter, so he smiled and said, if you encounter any insurmountable difficulties, you can contact me, and I will give you appropriate help. Normal living problems were left for the people of City of Silver and Moon City to solve themselves, but if there really were any insurmountable problems, such as widespread epidemics caused by climatization, Roland naturally would not stand by and do nothing. Thank you for your benevolence, Your Highness Lucifer, Colin Iliad said respectfully, bowing his head. Roland took out a map and introduced which island City of Silver and Moon City would live on next. At the end, Roland thought of something else, paused, and said, besides that, I also plan to build a biological laboratory on one of the other islands, which might require your help. The Forsaken Land of the Gods was almost a natural sample library, with a large number of animals and plants not found in the outside world. It would be a huge waste not to study the Forsaken Land of the Gods when researching things in the biological field. Biological laboratory. Colin Iliad was a bit puzzled, probably having never heard of this concept. Roland then briefly explained the existence of the biological laboratory. I understand. City of Silver will certainly provide enough biological samples for your highness. Colin Iliad, being extremely intelligent, understood after hearing the introduction about the laboratory and immediately said. The person in charge of Moon City next to him also quickly added, Moon City will do the same. Very good, what do you need? Roland smiled as he looked at them. Your Highness Lucifer, these are all things we should do, how can we ask you for remuneration? Colin Iliad said, his expression very serious. The person in charge of Moon City quickly followed up, Moon City is also the same. Roland glanced at them and did not forcefully demand to give them compensation. Roland knew very well that if he really did that, Colin Iliad would be panicked. After all, the grace of an existence who advocates equivalent exchange would only make people want to repay it as soon as possible. For the people of City of Silver and Moon City, this sudden station was a grace. Roland then chatted with Colin Iliad for a few more sentences, mainly about the livelihood of the people of City of Silver and Moon City after they came out, and then left. He also had to quickly sort out the construction team. By the time Roland finished his work and returned home, it was already evening. Compared to the slightly quiet situation during the day, the villa was very lively at night. Basically, those who were working or had gone out had already returned home, gathering noisily in the living room. Good evening, everyone. Roland, wearing the Lucifer vest, greeted the people in the house. Good evening, teacher. Jack Jones responded enthusiastically, showing how serious he was even when acting with himself. The others also greeted Lucifer one after another. After they exchanged greetings, Roland looked at Medici and said, remember to urge the Ruin royal family. Don't delay the handover of the colonial islands. I don't want to waste too much time on this. Tisk, don't worry, I know you're in a hurry to use it. The handover will be completed within 3 days. Medici clicked his tongue, picked up an apple, and took a bite, but what he said was very reliable. What colonial islands? Klein was a bit confused, and most of the others were curious as well. Roland blinked his eyes and did not explain to them about defrauding the Ruin royal family. He just said, you also know that I've been preparing to establish a biological laboratory during this time, so for this purpose, I managed to exchange for the ownership of several colonial islands from the Ruin royal family. The biological laboratory will be built on one of those islands later, and the people of City of Silver and Moon City will also settle on those small islands. Klein suddenly understood, and then thought of something, hesitated, and asked, what about the indigenous people on those islands? Roland smiled when he heard this. He looked at Klein and said, don't worry, the colonial islands I chose are all sparsely populated areas with very few indigenous people and many undeveloped areas, which is enough to ensure that the people of City of Silver and Moon City living there will not negatively impact the lives of the indigenous people. Klein breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this. He certainly hoped that the people of City of Silver and Moon City could escape their predicament, but he also did not want the indigenous people of the Five Seas to suffer persecution as a result. Roland then remembered the Five Seas Resistance Army at this time. A Sequence 3C Serpent was nothing major, but the Resistance Army itself indeed had some value for incorporation. Perhaps he could try to make contact next. As Roland thought this, he suddenly noticed that Ask seemed to be hesitant to speak. He immediately looked at him and asked with a smile, what's wrong, Ask, is there anything? Lucifer, I think perhaps I can begin the second treatment, Ask said after hesitating. I have completely sorted out the memories recovered last time during this period, and I have also adjusted my own state. Both my humanity and anchors can be considered stable. I should be able to further integrate past memories now. Roland raised his eyebrows and looked Ask up and down. After confirming that the other party indeed looked in good condition, he smiled and said, Ask, are you in a hurry? Not really, it's just that you all have been busy with important matters recently, and only I am idle, which makes me a bit embarrassed. Ask showed a slightly embarrassed smile and said. If I can recover my strength and devour divinity sooner, I can at least recover the numinous episcopate earlier and contribute to the cause sooner. Roland was not surprised by this. He smiled and said, "Ask, it's good that you have this intention, but it's too late today and not suitable. I will perform the second phase of memory recovery for you tomorrow." Okay. Ask naturally had no objections and nodded. Chapter 242 This damn desire to win. The next day, morning. Today, Backland had a rare good weather. The golden sunlight, unobstructed by clouds, freely bathed every corner of Backland. Yet, due to the season, it wasn't harsh, but rather comfortably warm. Klein had no commissions today and was concerned about Ask's memory integration, so he stayed home. "I understand the principle, but why can't you even beat young Amon at Gobang?" Roland, in Jack's vest, glanced at the chessboard in front of Klein, raised an eyebrow, and said. Yes, Klein was playing Gobang with young Amon, and judging by the board's situation, young Amon was about to get 5 in a row. Klein, holding a chess piece, lightly coughed. He looked at the chessboard but didn't deny anything. Instead, he generously looked at young Amon and said, "Young Amon is really smart. I only taught him Gobang yesterday, and today his skill has surpassed mine." Hearing Klein's praise, young Amon looked much more energetic. If he had a tail, he would probably be wagging it. He feigned modesty, coughed, and said, "No, I'm not that amazing." "No wonder you two get along so well. Children really need to be praised." Roland smiled at the sight, then ruffled young Amon's head, poured a glass of sweet iced tea for both of them, and brought over a fruit platter. He continued to watch Klein and young Amon play Gobang while sipping his tea. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps came from upstairs. The unreserved manner undoubtedly belonged to a certain Red Angel. Medici, finally done with his recent affairs and with a bit of free time, came down from the second floor, a cigarette clamped between his right fingertips. He looked at the 3 little ones gathered together, lightly rubbed his left hand against the cigarette, and with an inconspicuous spark, the cigarette lit up. Medici took a casual puff, then froze. Because the cigarette's flavor was off, it didn't taste like tobacco, but rather, mint. Medici narrowed his eyes, realizing something, and looked at Roland, who had already put down his teacup and was peeling an orange. "Don't look. I've replaced all your cigarettes with mint. You're still smoking with a child in the house. Don't you have any sense of responsibility? What if you lead the child astray?" Roland glanced at Medici, speaking righteously. Tisk. Medici pouted but didn't extinguish the cigarette in his hand. He let the mint cigarette burn, walked a few steps closer to them, and with a glance, understood what Klein and young Amon were doing. He immediately scoffed, "It's early morning, and you're all gathered to play Gobang. That's better than you smoking first thing in the morning." Roland shot him a glance and retorted ungraciously. He then rummaged through the fruit platter for a while, threw a large, round apple to the other party, and said, "Go eat your apple." Medici caught the apple, finally extinguished the mint cigarette in his hand, and casually tossed it into the ashtray on the coffee table. Then, while crunching on the apple, he found a spot next to Roland and sat down, his gaze fixed on the chessboard, occasionally making sarcastic comments as he watched. Then Roland noticed that Klein, who had just been dominated by young Amon, suddenly started gaining the upper hand, completely changing the one-sided situation. Clearly, if this wasn't Klein's potential being stimulated, then he hadn't been serious while playing with young Amon, merely teasing the child. Now, unable to bear Medici's taunts, he began to display his true strength. Young Amon naturally noticed this but didn't feel wronged or angry. Instead, his expression became more serious, and his moves on the board became increasingly tricky. It was clearly just a game of Gobang, but now it looked as intense as Go. This damned desire to win. Roland shook his head, picked up his sweet iced tea, and took a sip, only to be nudged by Medici's elbow. "What is it?" Roland looked at him, puzzled. "Where's my teacup?" Medici looked at him and asked. "How could I possibly know?" Roland looked at him, bewildered. "Yesterday, all the tea sets were cleaned by me and put in the kitchen. However, when I went to the kitchen just now, I couldn't find my cup. Besides you, has anyone else touched these today?" As Medici spoke, he took another crunching bite of his apple, looked at Roland, and said with sharp eyes, "Confess and be lenient, resist and be punished severely." Roland blinked, finally remembered something, and smiled a little guiltily, saying, "Is it possible that your cup is in the trash can?" "What happened?" Medici asked, squinting at him. "Last night, I was a little hungry, so I went to the kitchen to forage for food, and then accidentally, it broke." Roland said this, shrugging, and then became self-righteous again, saying, "I didn't do it on purpose, and clearly, the quality of this cup was too poor. It just accidentally got bumped. Why don't you buy a sturdier one next time?" The last sentence was even a very sincere suggestion. Medici. 6. Why is everyone gathered there? While Roland and Medici were arguing about whether the cup's quality was the problem or Roland's actions, footsteps came again. Will lightly hopped down the stairs, approaching them with curiosity. Then he naturally found a corner opposite Roland and sat down, reaching into the fruit platter to grab an orange. His gaze fell on the chessboard in front of Klein, and after watching for a long time, he said, "Is this a game invented by Rosal?" Why not?" Roland smiled, then briefly explained the rules of Gobang to Will. "Sounds simple, so sour." Will was about to comment when he suddenly frowned. It turned out that the orange segment he had just eaten was terribly sour. "You just prefer sweet things, right? I think it's fine." No sooner had Roland finished speaking than Will, with lightning speed, stuffed another segment of fruit into Roland's mouth. The latter froze, then also frowned, and couldn't help but pick up the sweet iced tea and take a sip. "Sour, right," Will said, revealing a victorious smile. As a snake of fate, Will had always adhered to the principle of doing what was appropriate for his age, so he didn't feel childish. "Ha." Medici, nearby, laughed unreservedly at this moment, full of mockery. Roland immediately looked at him unpleasantly. However, just when everyone would have expected him to make Medici experience the sour orange, Roland suddenly picked up an orange segment and stuffed it into Klein's mouth. "Hiss, why me?" Klein's face wrinkled from the sourness, and he asked, quite perplexed, like a cat watching a show that suddenly got beaten. Chapter 243, The Death Archon reappears. "What do you think? I saw you trying to hold back your laughter." Roland glanced at him, speaking in an exasperated tone, then looked at Medici with a bright smile. He naturally wouldn't let go of the culprit. However, compared to others, the difficulty of feeding sour oranges to Medici was much greater, and the living room immediately became lively as the two began a chase. "Is it really that sour?" Little Amon looked curiously at the remaining orange in Will's hand, showing an inquisitive expression, with a hint of eagerness, embodying the principle of, no mischief, no trouble. "If you want to know, why don't you try it?" Will instigated, like a mischievous child, or like the queen enticing Snow White to eat the poisoned apple. "Don't, it's really very sour, and not just sour, but also a bit bitter," Klein quickly interjected. He had just drunk several sips of sweet iced tea to barely suppress the sourness, and really didn't want to see little Amon suffer the same fate. After all, Klein had a conscience. But everyone else ate it. Little Amon showed a hesitant expression. He suddenly jumped off the sofa, ran to the kitchen, poured a large glass of milk, then carried the milk back to the sofa, and picked up a segment of the fruit to put in his mouth. Then, little Amon showed an expression of doubting life. When Ask came downstairs, he found a group of people gathered mysteriously around the coffee table, all with very subtle expressions. "What's wrong?" Ask asked, looking over in confusion. Everyone remained silent, merely beckoning to Ask. And so, another victim of the sour orange was added. When Roland, wearing the Lucifer persona, came downstairs, there was already one more person, Ask, sitting around the coffee table. He shook his head, looking at the group who clearly hadn't given up on tricking him, and said with a smile, "If you like sour oranges so much, why don't I buy 2 pounds for each of you later, so you can eat them slowly?" Everyone immediately showed awkward expressions. Roland then walked over and sat opposite Ask, smiling as he said, "Are you ready?" Ask, still reeling from the sourness of the orange, paused, then remembered what he was originally preparing to do. He nodded, his gaze gentle yet firm as he said, "I am ready." "Good." Roland nodded, raised his left hand, and with a snap of his fingers, the familiar figure reappeared in this era. What is the principle behind this, exactly? As someone witnessing Roland directly summon the time shadow for the first time, Will was completely absorbed, but the more he watched, the more confused he became, completely unable to understand how Roland managed to do it. Medici, who was already accustomed to this scene, naturally wouldn't delve into it. He merely looked at the death console, examining this not-so-familiar existence, then, perhaps thinking of something, let out a sneer. Klein, on the other hand, was purely nervous. After all, he truly regarded Ask as a father figure, and now Ask was once again confronting his divinity and merging with his past. A slight misstep could lead to complete failure, so he was naturally extremely anxious. To Uncle Ask's, little Amon was purely confused. He rubbed his eyes, looked at Ask, then at the death console, and after a moment's thought, reached out and tugged at the latter's sleeve, asking earnestly, "Are you Uncle Ask's twin brother?" The death console, who had just opened his eyes in the future and was barely awake, heard little Amon's question, which made him pause. Then he realized that everyone in the room seemed to be looking at him. Even the death console, who was in some ways like a blank slate, couldn't help but feel nervous in this situation. His bewildered gaze swept over everyone in the room, finally landing on Lucifer, and he asked, "Is something wrong? Am I out of place?" "It has nothing to do with you, they are the ones with issues," Roland, in his Lucifer persona, said with a smile. "Oh." The death console looked as if he had sighed in relief. He then lowered his head to look at little Amon and froze. As the death console of the Balaam Empire, he naturally recognized Duke Amon of the Tudor Empire, and had even read many works related to him. So, facing the young Amon before him, the death console couldn't help but hesitate, unsure of what the other party was doing. "You don't need to treat him as Amon, just treat him as a child named Amon," Roland, in his Lucifer persona, explained in due time. The death console immediately breathed a sigh of relief. He still didn't really want to face the true Amon. After all, whether it was his few interactions with Amon or the works he had read, they all made the death console aware that Amon was by no means benevolent. Then, after a few seconds of thought, the death console looked at little Amon and answered earnestly, "Not twin brothers, I am also Ask, I am his past." Wow! Little Amon blinked his eyes, showing a surprised expression, unsure if he understood or not. After answering little Amon's question, the death console looked up at Lucifer. He clearly had no intention of asking why there were so many people in the room, but simply said with a slightly happy smile, "We meet again, friend." "Yes, we meet again. It seems you've been doing well during this time." Roland, in his Lucifer persona, showed a genuinely warm smile. He scrutinized the death console, clearly sensing a difference in him compared to the last time he was summoned. If the previous death console was a purely hollow puppet, then this time, the puppet was clearly filled with something, not much, but definitely present. Your mask is very useful." The death console nodded, revealing a happy smile, and said, "After I returned, I felt the existence of emotions for the first time. It's good, I like it very much." "That's not bad." Roland was not surprised by this result. He looked at the death console, as if looking at a work whose prototype was directly carved, and also like looking at a friend, saying with a smile, "Has the god of death noticed your change?" "No, father rarely pays attention to me." The death console shook his head, then seemed to recall something, adding, "Father has been very busy recently, he has formed a partnership with the primordial demoness and seems to want to do something very important." As soon as these words were spoken, the expressions of everyone in the room changed slightly. No one present, except for little Amon, was unfamiliar with history, and they naturally understood what the death console was referring to, the cooperation between the god of death and the primordial demoness, which was about to unleash the pale disaster. "Tisk, it's actually this period," Medici pouted slightly, somewhat annoyed. He had always disliked Salinger, and naturally resented Salinger's use of the power of the River of Eternal Darkness's tributary to accommodate the Red Priest uniqueness. Not to mention that this matter could very likely lead to the Red Priest uniqueness being contaminated by the River of Eternal Darkness, which was simply a disaster for Medici. Chapter 244, Blank Doll Heart. The Pale Disaster, Klein frowned. Although he hadn't personally experienced it, just reading the various records was enough to know what a catastrophe it was. Will probably recalled something as well, shaking his head and saying, "To be honest, I never expected Death to dare to do that back then." He truly wasn't afraid of. As a Sequence 1, and also as an old-timer who had lived since the Third Epoch, Will naturally knew many secrets, including information related to the Old Ones and the Pillars. So he knew that Night, Death, and War God plus the hunter and witch pathways, as well as the corresponding 2 portions of uniqueness, could synthesize the 4th pillar. And the 4th pillar was different from the other 3 great pillars. Once this pillar was born, it would mean the destruction of the universe. Although death at that time was still far from synthesizing the 4th pillar, the distance wasn't that remote. After all, hunter and witch were already there, the river of eternal darkness was also there, and he himself was death. If he truly managed to conquer the North Continent and eliminate the Evernight goddess and war god, who knew if he would really go mad and synthesize the 4th pillar? It's quite normal. After all, he even dared to cooperate with that lunatic, primordial demoness. What else wouldn't he dare to do? Roland said with a smile, then glanced at Medici and sighed softly. What do you mean by that? Medici narrowed his eyes, looking at him. I just feel that compared to the other Red Priest uniqueness holders, you are truly too normal, Little Red. Roland said this seriously. He looked at Medici and said, sometimes I feel that you are more suited to be a warrior. Roland genuinely thought so. Although Little Red was born with a naturally sarcastic constitution, firstly, it was not uncommon for good hunter prospects to be found in other pathways, and it was perfectly fine for Little Red to become one of the hunter prospects in other pathways. Secondly, although Medici was also skilled at schemes and intrigues, in a certain aspect, he was truly a bit too righteous. In terms of creating trouble, he simply couldn't compare to the spontaneous brilliance of Cheek, Tudor, or even those crazy men and women like Death. How is this not Little Red encountering a talented opponent and being unable to defeat them despite his best efforts? Roland summarized in his mind. If I'm not suitable, are you? Medici didn't think he was unsuitable to be a Red Priest, and immediately looked at Roland irritably. Just a little sentiment. Roland didn't care about his reaction, smiled, and looked at Ask. Just like last time, Ask had already fallen into memories, seemingly engaged in an intense tug-of-war between humanity and divinity. Roland watched for a while, and after confirming that the other party was fine, he looked at Death Consul and saw that he looked as if he wanted to speak but hesitated, then hesitated but wanted to speak again. He couldn't help but smile and asked, "What's wrong, Xiao Ji? The pale disaster you speak of, is that what Father is going to do next?" Death Consul asked, his gaze slightly curious. It seems I haven't introduced it to you. The Pale Disaster, a catastrophe unleashed by your father on the South Continent, caused countless deaths and made the 7 gods, who were always at odds, choose to unite for the first time. Roland smiled and briefly introduced the history of the Pale Disaster to Death Consul, finally saying, "In the end, this matter concluded with Death's demise, and you were probably at that time split into 2 souls by your father, beginning an endless cycle of reincarnation." Death Consul paused after hearing Roland's words. He probably thought for a while, and finally said sincerely, "It sounds like a very bad thing, but I'm sorry, I haven't learned emotions like compassion yet. I can't feel sad for them." The current Ask would feel guilt and pain because of the Pale Disaster, and would experience various complex emotions. But the former Death Consul had not yet learned these emotions. His human part had been suppressed for too long, and he only ever had a scumbag father as a role model. Even though he now possessed some emotions that could be called love due to Roland's mask, there were still too many deficiencies compared to ordinary people. No need to apologize, no one expects too much from a puppet. It's enough that you understand this is a bad thing. Roland shook his head. He naturally wouldn't demand too much from a puppet that had just begun to develop a sense of self. After all, as a little Naya, Roland knew better than anyone how difficult and long a process it was to go from an empty puppet to learning the various emotions possessed by ordinary people. Death Consul pursed his lips. He thought for a few more seconds, then suddenly said, "Is there anything I can do?" Roland paused, looking at Death Consul with slight surprise, and said, "Why do you ask that? I truly don't understand many things, and I can't feel any emotion towards the coming disaster, but..." Death Consul paused here. He tilted his head to glance at Klein, then his gaze swept over everyone else in the room, finally landing on Roland, and he said, "You don't like this." He paused, then Death Consul added seriously, "Friends should help each other, so I should help you." Roland raised an eyebrow, then suddenly smiled and said, "What, everyone in this room is your friend now? This is their first time meeting you. But you are my friend, and they are your friends, so they are my friends, Death Consul said with a serious expression, then glanced at Ask and continued. And they are also his friends, so they are my friends. Roland chuckled at this, seemingly in a good mood. He looked at Death Consul and murmured as if in feelings, you learned much faster than I did back then. Death Consul looked at him in confusion. However, for this matter, to be honest, you probably really can't help much. Roland shook his head. Even if he didn't mention the difficulty of changing crucial historical nodes, even if it could be changed, Death Consul, a sequence 2, could hardly do anything under the noses of Death and Primordial Demoness, who were both sequence 0. If this matter could be easily resolved, the 7 gods wouldn't have needed to unite. On the contrary, if Death Consul, a sequence 2, were to be discovered by Death, the trouble would be immense. Even if he wouldn't die, he would certainly be punished, perhaps beaten half to death and then locked in a dark room. This wasn't some crucial historical node. If it really happened, it just happened. Death Consul seemed a bit dejected. Roland looked at him like this, thought for a while, and then suddenly said, although you can't help much with this matter, I do have something related to it that you might be able to help with. What help? Death Consul immediately looked happy. Can you sense where your other half, besides Ask, is in this era? Roland asked with a smile. Chapter 245 Death Archon and Uniqueness. Death Consul did not answer immediately. He probably sensed for a while before nodding and saying, I can sense his situation. It's very bad. Father might have erased the consciousness of that half of the soul. When Death Consul said this, his expression remained calm. Evidently, even when facing his own misfortune, he was unable to show the appropriate emotions, as those emotions basically did not exist. Roland was not surprised by this. He merely asked, can you sense the artificial death uniqueness that half of the soul has integrated? Death Consul nodded again, then hesitated before saying, actually, I can barely control its power. This surprised Roland. He glanced at Death Consul, then understood. Compared to Ask, who had already undergone reincarnation and washed away the various influences of death, the Death Consul from 1,000 years ago had an even more intimate relationship with death. In this situation, it was not strange for him to be able to control the power of the uniqueness. Roland just asked with interest, to what extent can you control it? Is it just simply issuing oracles? Or, a deeper level of application? Death Consul thought for a few seconds before saying, basic use is not a problem, but it's impossible to exert its full power. However, he hesitated, then continued, however, if too much is used, Father might revive in this era. Roland was not surprised by this. Ask was originally Death's vessel for revival, and the artificial death uniqueness must have contained Death's contingency plan. To be honest, it was only because Death was too greedy, attempting to covet the river of eternal darkness, otherwise he would have revived long ago. Roland merely pondered for 2 seconds before saying, you don't need to control too much of the uniqueness's power. You just need to make people believe that you have assimilated the uniqueness. Roland then briefly introduced the numinous episcopate's affairs to Death Consul, smiling as he said, although the artificial death faction has now fully sided with Lord Ask, due to various reasons, most people in the royal faction still choose to support Pale Empress Sha. They do not acknowledge that Ask has truly returned or even mastered the uniqueness, condemning it as a conspiracy of the artificial death faction. Due to the divergence between the two major factions, most of the other smaller factions are now wavering and dare not easily take sides. Did all the people in the royal faction truly not believe in Ask's return? Not necessarily. It's just that Sha, after all, possessed a sequence 1 characteristic of the death pathway and had been in power for many years, having already developed a group of trusted aides and won over the majority of hearts within the faction. Therefore, when faced with Ask's oracle, even if many people's hearts wavered, they still chose to stand with Sha's faction for the sake of their interests. Roland had long anticipated this and even welcomed it, simply silently adding those stubborn, unrepentant, unrecyclable wastes to his list. Roland now suddenly brought this up to Death Consul, also thinking about whether he could use Death Consul to further stir up internal strife within the numinous episcopate, preferably making those wavering individuals within the royal faction fight with the steadfast Sha faction, which would be more interesting. What do you want me to do? Death Consul calmly looked at Roland. Roland then pulled out a list from his pocket and handed it to Death Consul, saying at the same time, "This is a list of all the unrecyclable wastes in the numinous episcopate, that is, the incorrigible individuals who have committed great mistakes and are unwilling to repent. I hope you can use the power of the uniqueness to punish them." Roland was not a very harsh person. Although he liked good people, he was also willing to give those who had made mistakes but were willing to repent a chance to reform. Otherwise, he would not have become friends with Ask and cooperated with the true creator. But some people in the numinous episcopate were truly unrecyclable waste. They had done a lot of bad things, and now, facing the new rules set in Ask's oracle, they had no intention of obeying them. So, Roland couldn't be blamed for making an example of them. Good. Death Consul took the list, glanced at it, nodded, and then looked at Roland and asked, "How do you want to punish them?" The names marked in red should return to the embrace of death, that is their best destination. As for the rest, Roland had naturally prepared for this aspect long ago, saying unhurriedly. South Continent, a certain mausoleum. Hurdle was performing his daily prayers. Ever since receiving the artificial death's oracle, whether out of loyalty to Lord Azek, Death Executor, or to show others, Hurdle had made it a point to pray whenever something happened during this period. His prayers were not entirely in vain. Occasionally, he would receive a response. However, Hurdle wasn't sure if it was his illusion, but he always felt that sometimes the artificial death who responded to him was a bit strange, seeming overly indifferent and not speaking, but other times it was the one he was familiar with, the one who issued the oracle. Could Lord Azek, Death Executor, be half mad? Hurdle sometimes couldn't help but have such a guess. After all, it was well known that half-mad people would be like this, sometimes clear-headed, sometimes insane. When Hurdle was still a small soldier, he had heard some stories about Blood Emperor Tudor. It was said to have been spread by a certain duke. Blood Emperor seemed to have gone half-mad because he jumped to a non-adjacent pathway, and his clear-headed time each day was minimal. Most of the time, he was either indifferent or cruel, fully displaying his madness. Although Lord Azek, Death Executor, did not jump to a non-adjacent pathway, it was still normal for his lordship, who was once only sequence 2, to go half-mad if there were some improprieties when advancing to sequence 1 and assimilating the artificial death uniqueness. This was a common situation in the Beander domain. Of course, besides the guess that Lord Azek, Death Executor, was half-mad, Hurdle actually had another guess. He suspected that Your Majesty, the Underworld Emperor, had actually awakened in Lord Azek, Death Executor, but not completely, which was why he was like this. Just as Hurdle was lost in thought, the door to his mausoleum was knocked upon this time, and the knocking was very urgent. What's wrong? What happened that's so urgent? Hurdle opened the door and let the person in, asking. He didn't know why he suddenly thought of the last time he received an artificial death oracle, and his eyebrow couldn't help but twitch. Lord Hurdle, divine punishment. Our Lord has brought down divine punishment. The messenger was somewhat terrified, speaking incoherently. Hurdle was stunned, his eyes widening a bit. He immediately told the other party to explain the situation. After understanding who had suffered the divine punishment, he breathed a sigh of relief and then said, "What are you panicking about? Those people suffered divine punishment because they didn't believe in the existence of God and treated God's oracle as nothing. Naturally, they would incur God's wrath. We are different from them." Hurdle said this, as if comforting the other party and also himself. He took a deep breath, then suddenly showed a smile and said, "Now I'm curious if Shia will continue to deny the existence of God." Chapter 246. The Pale Queen is thinking. For Pale Empress Shah, the experiences during this period could probably be described as a bolt from the blue. Shia never expected that after being the Pale Empress for so many years, and having seemingly unified the royal faction of the numinous episcopate, she only needed to either reclaim or eliminate that restless old man, Hurdle, to completely unify the numinous episcopate. Furthermore, in the future, if she could obtain the death uniqueness, it might even be possible for her to advance to sequence 0 and become the new death. Yet, in such an excellent situation, death suddenly returned and issued an oracle. Of course, Shia did not believe that death had truly returned. In her opinion, this was either Hurdle's plan going awry or succeeding, meaning the death uniqueness had truly come alive due to their reckless actions, becoming an existence like the hidden sage, or someone had mastered the death uniqueness and was causing trouble under a disguise. But no matter which it was not good news for Shia. Just looking at the hidden sage's style, it was clear that a uniqueness gaining sentience was not a good thing for beyonders of that pathway, especially for beyonders like Xia who possessed a sequence 1 characteristic. And if someone had truly secretly mastered the uniqueness, Xia did not think the other party would let go of the sequence 1 characteristic she possessed, they would surely seize it. Moreover, since the other party issued an oracle in the name of death and established new rules for death's believers, they certainly had designs on the numinous episcopate and intended to seize power. Therefore, Xia had truly been so worried during this time that she couldn't sleep well. Of course, if Xia chose to be a slacker and meekly lay flat and surrender power and the sequence 1 characteristic at this time, perhaps the so-called death would not do anything to her. However, firstly, this would be gambling on the other party's benevolence, effectively putting her fate into their hands, and as the Pale Empress, Xia truly did not believe that high sequence beyonders of her pathway possessed such a thing as benevolence. Secondly, Xia was also unwilling to do so. She had been the Pale Empress for so many years, only one step away from sequence 0. Although this step might trap her for life, if you asked Xia to give up easily, she would certainly be unwilling. Thirdly, Xia suspected that the death who issued the oracle might have some issues with his state, otherwise, why would he not reveal himself to unify the numinous episcopate or descend with power? It was precisely for these reasons that, upon learning of the oracle, Xia immediately made a decision. She contacted her confidants and branded it as a conspiracy of the artificial death faction, while also appeasing the members of the royal faction who were slightly swayed by the oracle, and secretly began investigating what this so-called death was all about. Originally, all of Xia's actions went smoothly. After all, she had managed the numinous episcopate for many years and could almost be considered its de facto leader. Although the artificial death faction, led by Hurtle, stubbornly resisted, the royal faction's base was preserved, and most of the other small factions also became suspicious of the oracle because of this, choosing not to defect immediately. But today, Xia frustratingly discovered that all her arrangements during this period were likely in vain. And hearing her subordinates report, learning that many people had suffered divine punishment, Xia's body swayed. She could already foresee how many people would turn to death after today's incident. Perhaps, apart from her completely loyal confidants, even many among the core strength of the royal faction would be swayed. In divine punishment, Xia pursed her lips. She still did not think her judgment of death was wrong, but it now seemed that the state of that death was much better than she had originally guessed. This was undoubtedly bad news for Xia. A cloud of gloom shrouded Xia's eyes, and she quickly thought of something else, instructing, "Compile a list for me, quickly." Facing her demand, her subordinates naturally dared not delay, and soon a list arrived in Xia's hands. This is a list of all the members who have suffered divine punishment that we can currently compile, but many members performing duties outside have not been included. They are too far from us, and their situation cannot be confirmed for a while. But rest assured, I have already arranged for people to contact them, and I believe this part of the list will also be compiled soon, the subordinate said humbly after handing over the list. Xia nodded slightly as she listened to her subordinate, not blaming him for anything. She was not one of those unreasonable superiors. Xia merely lowered her head to browse the list, and after reading it, she exhaled and said, "All the people who suffered divine punishment are those who did not abide by the new rules and had previously committed serious violations of the new rules. This even includes a member of the artificial death faction." Xia put down the list, her gaze falling on her subordinate, and said, "Do you know what this means?" The subordinate paused before replying, "The returned death does not belong to the artificial death faction." This conclusion should have been reached long ago. Xia shook her head, her expression cold as she said, "This means that this death, more than anything else, values the new rules he is promoting. Perhaps it's just to establish his authority." The subordinate suggested a possibility. He was Xia's direct subordinate, so he occasionally spoke more boldly. If the other party only wanted to establish his authority, he wouldn't need to make any distinctions, he could just kill everyone. However, the fact is that the degree of divine punishment each person suffered was different, and this difference stemmed from the crimes they committed. Xia paused here, a rare trace of confusion appearing in her eyes. I originally thought these so-called new rules were just an attempt by the other party to assert his existence and control the numinous episcopate, but he actually cares about these rules. Xia was truly confused. After all, as a descendant of Death and the Pale Empress of the numinous episcopate, Xia had been educated in the Byron royal family's ways since childhood, and such an upbringing had instilled in her a disregard for life, which made her even more unable to comprehend these new rules. However, this at least allows me to rule out one possibility. Xia shook her head, suppressing the doubts in her heart, and erased her previous speculation that death was a uniqueness that had gained sentience. Given the characteristics of the death pathway, if it truly were a uniqueness that had gained sentience, it would definitely be even colder and more ruthless. So, who exactly is it, Knight? God of combat? Xia speculated in her heart, yet she was enveloped by new confusion. Because she thought of Hurtle, Xia knew very well how loyal Hurtle was to Death, even though his man-made death plan was essentially still for the resurrection of Death. Such a person might not be able to prevent Knight, God of combat, and the like from stealing the uniqueness, but he would absolutely not help the other party control the numinous episcopate. And now, looking at Hurtle's stance, he clearly genuinely wanted to help the new Death control the numinous episcopate. Chapter 247 Death Archon and Klein. I am very sure that Hurtle was also one of the members who received an oracle, so, he must have recognized who the other party was, which is why he was so diligent. Xia's heart sank at this thought, and she had a bad premonition. Could it be that Death has truly returned? For her, it would truly be worse than Night controlling the uniqueness. After all, Xia knew very well how ruthless the former Death, Your Majesty, the Underworld Emperor, was. He would definitely eliminate her, an existence who had touched a sequence one characteristic, without hesitation. He would not show her mercy just because she was a so-called descendant. Go investigate everyone who received an oracle before, again. I must know who the Death they saw truly is. Xia immediately ordered. She had actually arranged for people to investigate once before, but most of those who received the oracle kept their mouths shut, so no useful information was found. But now, facing the possibility of the old Death truly returning, Xia was a little flustered, which was why she gave a death order. After her subordinates left with the order, Xia patted her chest and comforted herself. It can't be Your Majesty, the Underworld Emperor, he would never be so benevolent. Death Consul naturally didn't know that his actions made Pale Empress suspicious of the old Death's return, causing her to lose herself and furiously try to find out who was truly behind Death. However, even if he knew, he probably wouldn't care. Death Consul just stared intently at the chessboard in front of him, holding a black piece in his hand. After thinking for several seconds, he placed the black piece onto the board. And Klein, across from him, held a white piece, his eyes lighting up. With a thud, he placed the piece, and his 5 pieces connected in a row, clearly indicating he had won. That's right, after dealing with the main business of the numinous episcopate, Death Consul, out of curiosity, took another look at the chessboard in front of Klein and Amon, and was then introduced to the game of Gomoku by a busybody. He was then persuaded to start playing chess. This was the 6th game Death Consul had played, and he lost each one very quickly. As for the others, little Amon had already gone to class with Will, he still had many lessons to learn today. Medici was busy again. After all, with Death Consul's actions, the numinous episcopate was almost certainly going to experience severe turmoil. He could take this opportunity to make some arrangements in advance, making it easier to swallow the numinous episcopate in one go when he cast his net later. Jack Jones was dragged away by Medici to help. In the latter's words, "You two, master and disciple, can't leave everything to me, can you? Someone has to help." It was clear that Medici might have been working too much overtime recently, and already had the resentment of a beast of burden towards his boss. Lucifer sat quietly by the side, drinking tea and watching Death Consul and Klein play chess. Probably for this reason, Klein didn't hold back at all this time, which led to his 6 consecutive victories. Sorry, Mr. Death Consul. Although Klein won, he wasn't arrogant or complacent. Instead, he smiled a little awkwardly. It's fine. Death Consul shook his head, looking at Klein, and suddenly, as if he remembered something, added, "You can just call me Mr. Azek." Ah! Klein was stunned. He looked at Ask, who was still struggling with past memories, with some hesitation. Before he could speak, he heard Death Consul say again. He is my future, and I am his past. I will eventually merge with him. For you, there is actually no difference. Actually, I never felt that you weren't the same person. Different titles are just to distinguish you better. Klein shook his head and said sincerely, of course, I don't deny that, compared to you, I am indeed more familiar with the current Mr. Azik. This was the truth. Klein had never seen Death Consul and Ask as two separate individuals, although he was certainly more familiar with the current Ask. Death Consul was, after all, a bit distant to Klein. Death Consul nodded at his words. He lowered his head to put the black pieces back on the board. Before the next game began, he suddenly said, "You can get familiar with me too." Klein was stunned. He looked at Death Consul with a slight surprise. After thinking for a moment, he said earnestly, "I am getting familiar with you, Mr. Death Consul." After a pause, Klein suddenly smiled, and said with a bit of emotion, "Actually, when I first learned of your existence, I was very worried for a time." Death Consul looked at him in confusion and asked, "Worried about what?" "Worried that Mr. Azik would be swallowed by the past, worried that he would no longer be himself, worried that the teacher I was familiar with would never come back." Klein didn't hide anything, softly expressing his true thoughts. He suddenly looked up at Death Consul, a relaxed smile on his face, and said, "It wasn't until I met you that I suddenly realized I was just worrying needlessly. Mr. Azik has always been Mr. Azik. Although he has made many mistakes in the past, your essence has never changed." Death Consul probably didn't expect Klein to say this and was stunned. He looked at Klein in silence for a long time before revealing a slightly gentle smile and saying, "I'm very happy that you feel that way. That's very good." At this moment, Death Consul seemed like Ask again. He paused, then suddenly looked at Klein and said earnestly, "I'm also very happy to meet you, Klein. To me, you are like a child. I had only seen such an existence in stories before, and now I finally have everything from the stories. This is truly wonderful." Klein was clearly a little embarrassed by such direct words. He smiled, reached out and scratched his hair, then coughed lightly, muttering softly, "Is this something that can be said directly?" Apparently, Klein, who was inherently more inclined to be subtle, didn't expect Death Consul to be so direct. "Why can't it be said?" Death Consul looked at him in confusion. This wasn't an act, he was genuinely very puzzled by this. "It's not that it can't be said, it's just, well, how should I put it, it makes one feel embarrassed, perhaps." Klein hesitated and explained, "People from where I'm from express emotions more subtly. Some things aren't said so directly." "I don't understand." Death Consul shook his head, not comprehending. He looked at Klein and suddenly asked, "You don't like it?" "No, I don't." Klein immediately shook his head. "So there's nothing wrong with it this way. You like it, and that's very good." Death Consul clearly had his own understanding and nodded. "Hey." Roland, who had been quietly drinking tea nearby, couldn't help but chuckle at this moment. He looked at Death Consul and Klein and said leisurely, "You two look like a cat type and a dog type now." "What do you mean?" Death Consul looked at him in confusion, waiting for an explanation. "Don't pay too much attention to it, it's just a metaphor. Of course, you can also understand it as a compliment," Roland said with a smile. "Oh." Death Consul clearly didn't dwell on it and nodded. Klein's smile was a bit helpless. He could tell that Mr. Lucifer really liked fluffy things. Of course, this was normal. Klein himself liked fluffy things, he just wouldn't want to turn others into fluffy things. And just then, Klein suddenly noticed that Ask's body trembled, and then he opened his eyes. "Mr. Azik, are you alright?" Chapter 248 The Past Changes the Future. "Mr. Azik, are you alright?" Faced with Klein's concern, Ask, even though he hadn't fully recovered from his past memories, still showed a gentle smile. He looked at Klein and said, "I'm fine. In fact, although this memory fusion had some twists and turns, there were no major problems. Perhaps with one more time, I can recover all my memories." "That's good." Klein breathed a sigh of relief. Although he had fully accepted the existence of the Death Consul and believed that Ask's essence had never changed, he was still somewhat worried about Ask fusing his memories because he knew that Mr. Azik had once been heavily influenced by that old geezer, the Death God. Ask then looked at Roland and said with a slight sigh, "Your mask helped a lot." I really don't know how to thank you, Lucifer. The process of Ask fusing his past memories and emotions this time was not exactly smooth. Although the essence of the past death console was no different from Ask, he was indeed too heavily influenced by the death god. These influences were not very evident when the death console was summoned as a time shadow, but they were omnipresent in the death console's true past, almost ingrained in his bones. Because of this, in the torrent of memories just now, there was a moment when Ask almost lost his sense of self and completely became the death console of the past. That death console, whose self was completely suppressed, and who was, to some extent, a puppet in the death god's hands. But the mask worn in his soul pulled Ask back at the most crucial moment. That love, which would absolutely not belong to the death console, became Ask's anchor, allowing him to break free from the death god's influence and become completely clear-headed, thus fusing that past with his self-awareness. If you really want to thank me, then continue to live on. Roland said with a smile. Fusing past memories isn't the hardest challenge, the hardest part is still with your other half of the soul. This was the truth. Although fusing past memories was a huge challenge, the problem with Ask's other half of the soul, which had fused with the uniqueness, was clearly greater. Otherwise, in the original work, the Evernight goddess would not have said, if Ask fuses that half of his soul, he will become the death console of the past. If Roland guessed correctly, that half of Ask's soul should be his divine part. It could be said that even if the current Ask completely fused his past memories, if he lost in the confrontation with his divine self, everything would be in vain. I know, I will definitely defeat my divinity and live on. Ask naturally knew that what Lucifer said was true. He exhaled, but there was no dejected expression on his face. Instead, he seemed to have thought of something again, smiling gently, his gaze sweeping over Roland, Klein, and finally landing on the death console. Ask looked at the death console, who was holding a black piece in his hand, his gaze falling on the chessboard in front of him, and then returning to the death console's face. That face, which had always been calm, now carried a true gentleness. Ask was in a daze. In the memories he had just fused, he had never seen his death console self show such an expression. The former death console was always cold and calm. He would only meticulously carry out the death god's various commands, and could only do so. But now, some things had quietly changed. So Ask and the death console looked at each other, and he suddenly smiled gently. I also believe that I will no longer be the selfless puppet I once was, because the puppet has grown a heart. The death console was stunned. He probably thought for a few seconds before saying seriously, you still need to be careful of Father. I know, I will be extremely careful of him. Ask nodded, then smiled and said, but I will no longer be afraid. The former me could grow a hint of self under the death god's suppression, and the current me will never let that self completely disappear. Roland raised an eyebrow at this, then suddenly curved his lips into a smile and said softly, how interesting. The past death console, because the current Ask received help from the future and gained a true self, and in turn, this self clearly also helped the current Ask to some extent. Roland even had a premonition that perhaps in future soul fusions, this self belonging to the death console would become the key for Ask's humanity not to be devoured by his divinity. Past, present, future, what has changed and what has not changed, Roland sighed in his heart, only finding it interesting. Ask's past has not truly been changed. Even if he gained a hint of emotion, this emotion did not bring about major changes to his past. However, in turn, this might change Ask's future. The past cannot be changed, but can the future be changed, even if this change comes from the past? Roland suddenly thought of many things, showing a thoughtful expression. After intermittently summoning existences like the ancient sun god and the war angel, Roland had more or less confirmed that the difficulty of truly changing the past in this timeline was similar to that of his homeland. Small details could be changed at will, but changing key nodes was as difficult as ascending to heaven. Otherwise, people around Roland, such as the true creator and Medici, should have already changed due to the alteration of historical key nodes. The fact was that despite repeated attempts by existences such as the ancient sun god, the past remained the same. Perhaps there were changes in minor details, but the overall direction remained unchanged. One could only say that history indeed had inertia. Of course, Roland sometimes wondered if everything would change if he were in those timelines and personally went to change those key nodes. After all, the fate of the current era was like this. The fate he personally changed would no longer change, but many events in which Roland did not intervene would revert to the original plot. Unfortunately, Roland did not have the ability to travel through time, so this conjecture could only remain a conjecture, with no way to experiment. And now, the situation of the Death Console in Ask brought some new thoughts to Roland. If directly asking others to change the past was impossible, then what if, like with the Death Console, one made a change that could be achieved without affecting the past, and then used this change in turn to alter the future of the person involved? Would that be feasible? Roland felt that this point could be observed to see if the Death Console's self could indeed become the key for Ask to devour his divinity, as he speculated. Chapter 249 talking about cooperation with Heiyi. If that were truly the case, could such an operation be replicated on the ancient sun god? Roland felt this might have some potential. After all, the ancient sun god's problem was quite similar to Ask's. Both had souls split in two, and both had the trouble of XX awakened within me. The difference was that as the part carrying humanity, Ask, at the cost of his soul again and again, washed away all madness and restored his true nature, while the true creator did not have this condition and could only endure it. As for the part carrying divinity, Roland thought of artificial death, then of Adam, and suddenly smiled, sighing in his heart. Aside from whether they possess self-awareness, what difference is there between them? Even, could what Adam possessed truly still be called self-awareness? An existence without emotion, caring neither for himself nor for those around him, whose every action was solely for the survival of Earth. Roland's gaze suddenly fell upon the Death Console, and he couldn't help but smile. Isn't this exactly the same? If the Death Console was a hollow puppet made by death, then wasn't Adam also a hollow puppet made by the former ancient sun god? The former was made into a resurrection vessel, a diligent tool to govern the country, while the latter was a pure savior machine. Ancient sun god, what a noble and cruel existence. Even to himself, Roland couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Exactly the same as what? The Death Console looked at him in confusion and asked. Don't mind it, I just suddenly thought of a friend. He is very much like you. Both hollow puppets without a self, Roland explained with a smile. Upon hearing this, the Death Console's expression showed a hint of curiosity, so he asked, does he have a self now? I hope he does, but in reality, it's hard to say. Roland shook his head. Although he had long ago put a mask on Adam and had once guided his emotions through various actions, it was still hard to say how much self Adam truly possessed now. In terms of progress, perhaps he was even behind the Death Console. That sounds regrettable. The Death Console seemed a little disappointed. Although he himself did not yet possess much self, the Death Console still hoped that similar existences could gain a self. This would bring him some comfort. I also find it regrettable. Roland smiled, then looked at Ask again and said, during the time you were integrating memories, I asked the Death Console to do something. Roland then briefly explained how the Death Console had just brought down divine punishment on the numinous episcopate's unrecyclable waste. Finally, he looked at Ask and said, now the numinous episcopate has fallen into great turmoil. If you can officially step forward before the turmoil ends, the difficulty of reclaiming the numinous episcopate will probably be reduced to the lowest. Ask, do you wish to act against the numinous episcopate now? Ask showed a thoughtful expression. He did not immediately agree or refuse, only saying, although my strength has recovered 90%, I am, after all, only sequence 2, even with divine edicts and divine punishment as backing, others may not dare to test me, but Pale Empress Sha will definitely not surrender easily. Even if I truly merge with the death uniqueness, she will not directly bow down. It's fine, Ask, I will provide assistance for you to reclaim the numinous episcopate. I will handle Sha. You just need to play your role as the Death Console and deal with the other members of the numinous episcopate. Roland said with a smile. Of course he knew that Pale Empress would not immediately bow to Ask, but it didn't matter. Even the most stubborn person would become obedient after a few beatings. This had already been verified in the original fate. Then I have no problem. Ask nodded. The only person he worried about was the Pale Empress. For others, even Hurtle, who was also sequence 2, dealing with them was not difficult for Ask. He was, after all, the former Death Console, the most favored descendant of the Underworld Emperor. Although this identity had brought Ask many hardships, it was not without its benefits. When do we act? Ask merely asked. No rush. Let the internal chaos of the numinous episcopate ferment for another 2 days. We also need to prepare for a complete takeover of the numinous episcopate, Roland said. Taking over an ancient organization with over 1,000 years of history was not a simple matter. Even with Ask as the legitimate successor, and even if all opponents were crushed, the remaining members of the numinous episcopate would essentially be free to take. But this did not mean that the remaining tasks would be without difficulty. On the contrary, with sufficient strength and Ask's presence, reclaiming the numinous episcopate was the easiest part. The truly troublesome part was how to transform this group of recyclable waste and arrange them in suitable positions to play their roles. After all, Roland didn't want to kill them all, but rather a group of useful tools. And we also need to guard against the unrecyclable waste causing trouble. Although a batch has been cleared this time, serving as a warning and likely making most people behave, once Ask takes over the numinous episcopate, some of these people might actually want to leave the numinous episcopate. Their leaving isn't a big deal, but if they cause trouble after leaving, that would be bad. Thinking of this, Roland looked at the death console and said, "Little G, I might need to trouble you with some more things later." Roland himself couldn't oversee all members of the numinous episcopate, but the death console was different. He could use the power of the death uniqueness, and to some extent, he could impersonate the old death by exploiting bugs. Thus, he could monitor anyone who had established a connection with death. Precisely because of this, having the death console suppress the initial chaos was the best choice. Okay. The death console did not ask what it was, only nodded. Roland then considered some other possibilities and made some arrangements, suddenly sighing in his heart. Alas, in some sense, the numinous episcopate is truly inferior to the Aurora Order. At least the foolish beauties are all fanatics. If the true creator says east, they won't go west. If the true creator says to do good deeds, they can immediately become saints. The numinous episcopate is much more complicated. Although the numinous episcopate outwardly still worshipped death, and even most of its internal members likely did truly believe in death, seeing how Shah, as the Pale Empress, could openly become the leader of the royal faction showed that everyone's faith in death was actually just so-so. This was both good and bad. Good in that an existence like Ask, with buffs and strength as his backing, could easily ascend to power without being firmly resisted by the old guard. Bad in that within a cult with impure faith, there would inevitably be a certain number of people fishing in troubled waters. These people prioritize their own interests, and when their interests are harmed, they will become troublesome. Fortunately, the problem isn't big, and having many opinionated people isn't entirely a bad thing. At least there will be more usable people. Foolish beauties, or ultimately foolish. Roland shook his head, then suddenly thought of something else and smiled. Compared to the numinous episcopate, I'm actually quite curious what reaction Knight will have after this matter concludes. Roland actually quite wanted to meet the Evernight goddess. Firstly, to check in for a souvenir, and secondly, to discuss cooperation with this old fox who had many schemes. Roland never thought he could have too many friends. Chapter 250 Shao Ke plays Medici. As for whether the Evernight goddess would turn hostile towards Roland due to Roland's strong support for Ask to merge his soul, reclaim the numinous episcopate as a tool, and other actions, Roland actually wasn't worried. Looking at the Night Church's overtures to Mr. Lucifer, and Lilith's attitude, it was clear that the Evernight goddess usually spied a lot and definitely knew about Roland's extraordinary qualities long ago. At the very least, she must have known that Roland could summon the ancient sun god. It was precisely because of this that, as a smart person, the Evernight goddess would absolutely not easily become hostile to Roland without fundamental conflicts of interest. That would be too dangerous and unnecessary. And what were the fundamental interests of the Evernight goddess? In the matter of Ask and the numinous episcopate, there was undoubtedly only one, the death uniqueness. Ask was never an enemy the Evernight goddess had to eliminate. This was clear from the original text. The Evernight goddess didn't mind doing Ask a favor in this matter. As for the numinous episcopate itself, for the Evernight goddess, who had a large enterprise, it was also dispensable, something that would be best to acquire but acceptable if not. Anyway, with the Evernight goddess's personality, she would absolutely not fall out with Roland over the numinous episcopate, as it would be too uneconomical. And regarding the ownership of the death uniqueness, Roland and the Evernight goddess actually had no conflict. After all, Ask, as the Death's resurrection vessel, could not truly accommodate the Death uniqueness and become a god. The risk was too high. Even Roland, although he was confident he could use various means to help Ask smoothly merge with his other half of the soul, he couldn't change the fact that Ask was the resurrection vessel itself. The connection between Ask and Death was too close. Even without mentioning the various modifications Death made to Ask, just the fact that Ask was Death's biological son meant he was Death's natural resurrection vessel in this world. This connection, which was not only rooted in bloodline but also existed in the field of mysticism, probably couldn't be completely severed even if Ask changed bodies. So, Ask stopping at sequence 1 was the best outcome. Going higher would be very dangerous. Of course, while there was no fundamental conflict of interest, this didn't mean Roland would easily give up the Death uniqueness. It was still the same old saying, why would one easily give away something they already possessed to an outsider? If they wanted the Death uniqueness, they could exchange something for it. Roland wouldn't really make an exorbitant demand. After all, he always sought a win-win situation in his dealings. If I can use this opportunity to naturally gain the Night Church's support for the reform, at least the subsequent transformation of Loan will be much simpler. Roland thought this, chatted a few more words with Ask and the Death Consul, then cancelled the summoning of the latter. He then informed the former that there would be a family reunion package as usual tomorrow, instructing Ask to prepare well and think about where to take the children to play tomorrow. After Ask happily went to do his homework for the family reunion package, Roland picked up his black tea and took a sip, his gaze falling on Klein across the sofa. He smiled and said, "Why haven't you left yet? Do you need something from me?" Not really," Klein smiled awkwardly. The reason he hadn't left immediately wasn't truly because he needed something from Mr. Lucifer, he simply hadn't thought of an excuse yet and felt that leaving directly would be impolite. "I should have gone with Mr. Isaac to plan the outing earlier," Klein secretly regretted it. He then cautiously glanced at Mr. Lucifer opposite him. When the other party looked over, he fumbled to pick up his coffee and took a sip, appearing very busy. Klein admitted that perhaps it was because Mr. Lucifer always seemed to have an opinion of him. Every time he was alone with Mr. Lucifer, he would feel a bit nervous and at a loss, just like being alone with a homeroom teacher during school, feeling extremely tense all over. Sigh. "I clearly want to build a good relationship with Mr. Lucifer," Klein sighed. Just as he was feeling disappointed and regretful, he suddenly heard the person opposite him ask, "How much longer until you advance to sequence 6? Klein was stunned, as if called upon by a teacher in class. His entire body tensed up, and he quickly replied, "My magician potion is almost digested. I can advance in half a month at most." As for the materials for concocting the sequence 6 faceless potion, Klein had naturally prepared them long ago. Not too slow. Roland smiled faintly, put down his cup, looked at Klein, and asked, "Have you thought about how to roleplay as a faceless?" "I currently have 2 ideas. One is to create another persona and roleplay, and the other is to find some people who need help, make a deal with them, and roleplay as them for a period of time." Klein nodded, speaking unhurriedly. Unlike in the original work where he knew little about faceless, the current Klein had no shortage of teachers or ways to acquire knowledge. He naturally knew the key points of the faceless sequence long ago and already had ideas on how to roleplay. "Good ideas." Roland nodded and smiled, then changed the subject, "But perhaps I can also give you some suggestions." "Please do." Klein immediately sat up straight, appearing to listen attentively. "No need to be nervous, just some small suggestions." Roland smiled. After taking a sip of black tea, he looked at Klein and said, "You should know that in some border cities, Medici has already lit the prairie fire, just waiting for this fire to completely burn throughout the Luan kingdom." Klein nodded. He certainly understood that this spark referred to the reform. Roland continued with a smile, "You also know that Medici will be busy with the numinous episcopate's affairs next. This is not something that can be resolved quickly, it will take some time." Klein nodded again. Being as sharp as he was, he naturally already had a guess in his heart and tentatively asked, "So, Mr. Lucifer, you mean for me to roleplay as Mr. Medici for a period of time?" "Not too stupid." Roland nodded, looking at Klein with a smile, and said, "Although Medici's strength is far from what it used to be, he can currently be considered sequence 2. Roleplaying him can maximize the digestion of the faceless potion. Of course, my purpose is not just that. Roland took a sip of black tea, then looked up at Klein and continued, besides role-playing Medici, you can conceive a new persona. I will have Medici arrange a suitable position for your new persona in the Revolutionary Army. For a while, you might need to be a bit busy. The main reason Roland wanted Klein to create a new persona for the Revolutionary Army was for Klein's Miracle Invoker ritual. Chapter 251, Roland meets Adam. Now, City of Silver here is unlikely to wait another 2.5 years before letting Klein out, so Roland felt it would be better to have Klein prepare in advance for a ritual of reproducing a communist country. Klein was stunned when he heard Roland's words. He first showed a confused expression, then thought of something and said, is this preparation for the Miracle Invoker's ritual? It's also to help you better understand the cause we are currently working on. No matter how many empty words are spoken, it's better to see for yourself, isn't it? I have a premonition that you will like it there. Roland smiled and nodded, then paused and added. Of course, Jack will not accompany you. This is a cultivation that belongs to you alone. When saying this, Roland's smile became even more radiant, fitting his persona. Klein, Mr. Lucifer, you didn't go to all this trouble just for this, did you? This absurd thought flashed through Klein's mind, then was suppressed by Klein, because he knew very well that no matter how absurd Mr. Lucifer's incarnation was, he wouldn't neglect proper business. Klein just thought of something and asked, do I need to stay there all the time afterward? Of course, Klein had no objection to supporting the cause of change, but some things still needed to be clarified. I won't make you stay there all the time. On New Year's Day 2 months from now, we will officially ignite that flame, and then, there will naturally be new arrangements for you, Roland said with a smile. Klein then nodded and asked again, when do I leave? No need to rush. On the day you officially advance to Faceless, I will personally send you there. Roland drank the last bit of coffee in his cup, then looked at Klein and said with a smile, for now, if you're bored, you can come with me to meet someone. Klein was a little puzzled and a little curious. He nodded, not refusing Mr. Lucifer's invitation. Roland slowly got up, tidied his clothes, and then led Klein out the door to a small chapel. There's a chapel here. Klein looked at the very small chapel in front of him, showing a confused expression. During this time, as a detective, he had traveled all over Backland, and he had a good idea of the churches in various parts of Backland. It was precisely because of this that Klein was confused, because in his memory, there was no church here at all. And the symbol of this chapel. Klein looked at the symbol on the chapel wall, which was very unfamiliar, but upon closer inspection, seemed to have been seen somewhere before. After several seconds of thought, he asked in confusion, Ancient Sun God. Yes, the symbol on the wall of this unfamiliar chapel did not belong to any existing god, but to a being who had long since fallen. This belongs to Adam. You should know his true identity, Roland glanced at Klein and said with a smile. Klein's expression immediately became subtle, and gossip about the ancient sun god's family that he had heard before surfaced in his mind. At the same time, Klein couldn't help but feel a little curious about what Mr. Lucifer was planning to do by suddenly visiting Adam. Curious as he was, Klein did not ask directly, but followed Mr. Lucifer into the small chapel. As soon as he entered, he saw a blond priest standing in the center of the hall. The other party was wearing a white robe and was praying with his eyes closed. As if sensing the movement behind him, the priest opened his eyes, turned around, and his seemingly compassionate, but actually emotionless, golden eyes looked at Klein, paused, and then turned to Mr. Lucifer. Long time no see, Lucifer. Adam said indifferently. I don't think we can say, long time no see. Haven't you always been here? Roland said with a smile, making it hard to tell whether he was telling a joke or the truth. Klein, on the other hand, couldn't help but size up the angel of imagination in front of him. Although he had long heard of his great name, this was the first time Klein had seen this divine incarnation of the Creator, the culprit behind Medici's hot pot incident, the angel of imagination Adam. At the same time, Klein also belatedly realized that the friend without self that Mr. Lucifer had mentioned earlier might be referring to him. I haven't always been here. I only spend half my time observing you. The rest of the time, I also have things to do. Adam shook his head and still said indifferently. Klein's mouth twitched when he heard this. Although he had long heard Jack complain about their group being spied on daily by existences such as spectators and true gods, Klein never expected someone to spy so righteously. Even though he knew that the other party was an emotionless hollow puppet, Klein felt a little unable to hold back at this moment. Hey! Roland couldn't help but laugh, then looked at Adam and said, "Do you mind telling me what you're doing now? You've been a bit too quiet lately, and I'm a little worried you're up to no good. As the saying goes, when a child is quiet, he must be up to mischief." The reason Roland suddenly decided to visit Adam was that he found that the other party seemed to have not appeared for a long time, at least not actively, which was not normal. "I'm just preparing for my godhood ritual," Adam answered quite frankly. His golden eyes calmly looked at Roland and said, "During this time, I've thought about many things, and I've also had a brief chat with the true creator. As you wished, I have made a decision. I will promote the changes you have initiated. I thought you had already made a decision, after all, you don't really have a choice." Roland was not surprised by Adam's words. He smiled, looked at Adam's golden eyes, and suddenly said, "But I'm still very curious, did you make such a decision purely out of self-interest, or?" He paused here, raised his hand and pointed at the position of Adam's heart, then slowly said, "Out of your heart. Is there a difference?" Adam looked at him quietly and asked, "Of course there's a difference. It means whether you are a pure robot, or a puppet that has grown a heart." Roland smiled as he looked at him. He didn't think Adam hadn't heard their conversation just now. Although Adam wasn't there at the time, he had directly mentioned the other party in his mind. According to the characteristic of, what is said must be prepared for, this was enough for the other party to know the relevant information. Adam was indeed well aware of the discussion between Roland and the Death Consul about the blank puppet just now. He glanced at Roland, then lowered his eyes and said, "Neither sounds like a good outcome. But at least, one of them sounds like there's still hope, doesn't it?" Roland smiled and retorted. He looked at Adam, then suddenly thought of something and asked again, "And I've been curious about one question for a long time." Chapter 252 The True Angel of Fantasy. What's the problem? Adam looked up at him. Did Adam exist? Roland looked at him, smiling as he asked, "I mean, the original Adam, did he truly exist?" Adam was stunned, probably not expecting Roland to ask that. He had no intention of hiding anything and said, "If you mean someone with an independent personality like Saussure, then he did exist. It's just that he is also me, essentially, there's no difference between us. I have no intention of discussing the distinction between incarnation and main body, that's a question destined to have no answer. I just want to ask you one more question." Roland looked at Adam and asked again, "How much of Adam is left?" It was clear that the true creator was synthesized with Saussure as the main body, there was nothing to discuss. But what about Adam? In the shell of this blank puppet, how much of Adam's part remained? Adam was uncharacteristically silent. After probably a few seconds of thought, he shook his head and said, "I don't know." He looked up at Roland, a rare hint of confusion in his golden eyes, and said, "I possess all of Adam's memories, but as you know, I have no emotions and no humanity, so I cannot judge how much of Adam truly belongs in this shell. Perhaps, as you said, I am just a savior machine without a self." Roland raised an eyebrow upon hearing this. He looked at the golden-haired priest in front of him and suddenly smiled, saying, "Perhaps we can conduct an experiment. For example, why not ask Adam himself?" Roland said with interest. Summoning Death Consul hadn't consumed too much of his spirituality, so Roland still had ample energy to summon another Adam. "What's the point of this?" Adam looked at him, puzzled. "The point is, after understanding how much of Adam's part is in your composition, we can try to separate you from Adam," Roland said, smiling as he looked at him. "Of course, not now, but after you advance to sequence 0. At that time, what belongs to the Sun God will go to the Sun God, and what belongs to Adam will go to Adam. This would be more conducive to merging into a pure Sun God, wouldn't it?" Adam was probably thinking. After a few seconds, he looked at Roland and asked, "I know this is your first plan. But how will you separate us? You shouldn't have that ability yet, should you?" "To be honest, I have no clue right now, and on this matter, I think perhaps you yourself are the expert," Roland said, smiling as he looked at Adam. "You've disassembled yourself more than once. I'm very curious, can you still do it now? If not, can you provide me with some useful advice?" It's difficult for me to disassemble myself again now, this is the price from back then. But perhaps I can indeed give you some advice as someone who has been through it. Adam first shook his head, then nodded, and then unhurriedly began to share some of his experiences in disassembling himself with Roland. Because it involved a lot of specialized knowledge, Klein, who was nearby, was completely bewildered and confused, feeling that he, as a poor student, really shouldn't be there. Roland, however, understood everything. He offered suggestions as he listened, appearing completely professional in his field. But why wouldn't he be? After all, when it comes to creating incarnations, Nyarlathotep is the professional. After discussing for a while, both gained something. Roland nodded, still wanting more, and said, then, next, let's see what the true Adam is like. With that, he snapped his fingers, using the person in front of him as a medium to summon the true angel of imagination from history. And so, the angel of imagination, very similar to Adam but looking younger, appeared in this small chapel. The young firstborn of God opened his eyes in confusion, then froze. Because the angel of imagination saw himself. No, that wasn't it, yet it seemed. The angel of imagination was confused. He looked at Adam in front of him, then at Roland and Klein opposite him. After a half-second of hesitation, he spoke, excuse me, where is this place? I seem to no longer be in my original space-time. The reason the angel of imagination was certain he wasn't in his original space-time was mainly because he found he couldn't contact his main body. Considering some information Saussure had previously told him, the angel of imagination naturally had some guesses about his situation. This is the fifth epoch, perhaps you know it. Roland observed the angel of imagination in front of him with interest. Unlike Adam, who appeared compassionate but was actually devoid of emotion, the young angel of imagination looked quite vibrant. His golden eyes openly revealed curiosity and a desire to explore this future world. It is here, as expected. The angel of imagination understood. Then he looked at Roland and smiled, saying, I do know you, and I know this era. Saussure mentioned these things. You are Mr. Lucifer, correct? You can also just call me Lucifer, Roland said with a smile. That would be too impolite. Although you may already know my essence, at least for now, I am still Adam, the Creator's firstborn. In terms of seniority, I am your junior, so it would be inappropriate to call you by your name directly. Adam shook his head. Although his words were somewhat formal, they didn't seem rigid, just a bit stubborn. Roland glanced at him, then suddenly smiled and said, no wonder Medici called you a fanatic. Before being told the truth, he never doubted your identity. You were probably a fanatical fellow from a young age. So Medici gave me that nickname, huh? Sigh, he's still so fond of giving people nicknames. The angel of imagination seemed to recall something and sighed, then looked at Roland and said earnestly. But I don't think there's anything wrong with being a fanatical person. At least, once I've set a certain goal, I will never waver. Perhaps that's why the sun god allowed you to bear the divinity. You are indeed more suitable to be a savior machine than Saussure, Roland said, smiling as he looked at Adam. His tone was gentle, but the content of his words was not so gentle. The angel of imagination listened quietly, showing no negative emotions due to the future Roland described. He said, if I am the most suitable one, then of course it should be me who does this. I just have some regrets. The angel of imagination seemed to have some regrets. He looked at Adam, meeting those golden eyes that held little emotion, and a rare trace of sorrow appeared on his face, saying, divinity is not the best answer for saving this world. Such a me might bring much suffering to many people, and even if the world is ultimately saved, sacrifices will still inevitably occur. Chapter 253 Awakening Adam's Humanity. It seems you understand yourself very well. Roland looked at him and smiled, then suddenly asked, then, how much of your essence do you think remains within the current Adam? Angel of imagination probably didn't expect Roland to ask that. He paused, then looked at Adam with a thoughtful expression. A few seconds later, he replied. About 1/3. The Creator's divinity is different from his humanity, and I am also different from Saussure. I cannot become the main body after fusion. Higher than I expected. Roland's gaze also fell on Adam, and he said, then I ask you, if the part belonging to you regains self-awareness and emotions, do you think you can, to a certain extent, change Adam's current state of having only divinity? Roland's previous idea for treating Adam was to stimulate the ancient sun god's feelings for this world. However, the part of the ancient sun god that Adam possessed was, after all, emotionless divinity. This kind of stimulation was like creating something from nothing, naturally making it incredibly difficult. After all, the emotional part had been given to Sorcerer. Now, after being inspired by Death Console, Roland had a new idea. The ancient sun god's divinity naturally lacked emotion, but the former angel of imagination was clearly not just divinity. Even if he was just a separated persona mask, he must have had corresponding humanity. It was just that, just as Death Console's self and humanity were completely suppressed by divinity and by death, the humanity possessed by Angel of Imagination was clearly also completely suppressed by the sun god's divinity. Therefore, rather than stimulating emotions in the sun god's divinity from nothing, drawing out the humanity that Angel of Imagination originally possessed might be a better solution. Of course, the drawback of this plan was that Adam would become more inclined towards the former Angel of Imagination. But then again, the current Adam could hardly be called the ancient sun god, so being inclined towards the former Angel of Imagination in this situation was not a bad thing. Just like true creator, he has always been more inclined towards Sorcerer. From this perspective, the ancient sun god has truly fallen. I wonder if he can be split and re-synthesized in the future. Roland's thoughts drifted for a second, then he looked at Angel of Imagination, smiling as he awaited his answer. Angel of Imagination was clearly lost in thought due to Roland's question. He occasionally looked up at Adam, and occasionally looked down at himself. After a while, Angel of Imagination looked up at Roland and said, "I cannot be 100% certain, but it might be feasible." Roland was very satisfied with this answer. He then looked at Adam, smiling, and said, "Then what is your opinion? I've said it before, I am him, and he is me. There is no difference between us. If you can truly guide his human choice to be the dominant one, I would be very happy. Gaining a part of humanity would also benefit my current state," Adam said calmly. He truly believed there was no difference between them. And humanity was something Adam had been seeking for many years but had never been able to obtain. Adam knew better than anyone that having only divinity was very dangerous. He might be able to maintain stability now, but if he couldn't gain a true mind and body, then in the future, when Adam wanted to advance further, when he needed to contend with God, lacking true humanity would put him at a natural disadvantage. Moreover, Adam suddenly spoke again. He looked at Roland, revealing a faint smile, and said, "This is also a good thing for a puppet without a self." Roland met his gaze, then suddenly smiled, saying with a hint of emotion, "That's why I said you are truly very similar." Roland then looked at Angel of Imagination, smiling, and said, "The you of this era has agreed, so what about you?" "Of course I have no objection, but how should it be done?" Angel of Imagination looked at Roland, puzzled and curious. "Actually, I don't have a very good method either. For now, it's probably about giving you a persona mask to wear." Roland said this and then snapped his fingers. "Is this the persona mask? I seem to feel a slight change, but it doesn't forcibly alter my emotions, it just amplifies some." Compared to Adam, who was completely created from nothing, Angel of Imagination clearly possessed a relatively abundant emotional capacity. He spoke while feeling the presence of the persona mask. That is its original purpose, an amplifier, a solid, unwavering anchor point. Roland said this, then suddenly thought of something, and looked at the two in front of him with deep meaning, saying, "I'm not sure if it can truly bring out your humanity, but at least if you wear this persona mask, when you fuse with the sun god's divinity in the future, yourself will not be completely devoured, at least a little bit will remain. This is indeed a very useful thing." Angel of Imagination immediately realized the function of the persona mask. It seemed that it could only amplify emotions and would not have much effect, but the fact that it could serve as an eternal anchor point already made it a divine artifact in this crazy world. Many times, the purpose of a ritual is simply to provide such an anchor point, and many times, only such an anchor point is needed for a person to win in the struggle against ancient gods and divinity, or at least not suffer a complete defeat. Unfortunately, it cannot change what has already happened. Roland sighed with a slight regret. He was naturally referring to the Adam of this era. Although the persona mask could serve as a permanent anchor point, Adam's humanity had been completely devoured in the fusion many years ago. Even if there was an additional anchor point now, it would be useless. After all, the struggle from back then was already over. Just like someone on the verge of losing control can still be saved, but someone who has already lost control is difficult to save. Even if an anchor point is added after losing control, it is useless. But at least, we can still try to change the future. Angel of Imagination smiled, speaking seriously and stubbornly. Adam looked at him, his expression still calm. He suddenly said, "Perhaps this will not have any effect. Then at least we tried." Just like a long time ago, the Creator wasn't completely sure he could defeat so many ancient gods and save humanity, but he still tried to do it. Angel of Imagination looked at him, their two pairs of golden eyes meeting at this moment, one pair gentle and stubborn, the other calm and indifferent. Just like you aren't completely sure you can save this world, but you are still doing it. This is me, this is us. We never do something only after being certain it will succeed, do we? Hey! Adam suddenly chuckled. This was so rare that Roland was momentarily stunned. Adam then chuckled and said, "You're right, we never do something only after being certain it will succeed." Chapter 254 Amon decides to take revenge on the fantasy angel. So you can make such a face too. That's truly surprising, Roland said, looking at Adam and stroking his chin with a sigh. Adam wasn't incapable of smiling, it was just that his previous smiles were always seemingly gentle but devoid of emotion, to the point of causing a slight uncanny valley effect after prolonged observation. However, Adam's current smile clearly carried a hint of emotion. "This is thanks to your mask. While it can't completely change me, it has indeed brought me some gains." Adam looked at Roland, his smile returning to its usual polite expression. He said, "Perhaps your plan really can work. Whether it works or not, we'll only know by trying," Roland said with an indifferent smile. He then looked at Angel of Imagination and said, "Well then, see you next time, Angel of Imagination. Remember to say hello to Sun God for me, and also ask Saucerer if he's willing to switch sides." Angel of Imagination's expression instantly became subtle. He seemed to hesitate for half a second, then nodded and looked at Roland, saying, "I understand. I will convey your message to them, but Saucerer probably won't be willing to follow you." "It's all right, I'll ask again next time," Roland said magnanimously. This magnanimous yet roguish attitude somewhat stumped Angel of Imagination, but he ultimately said nothing more. Roland then naturally cancelled the summons of Angel of Imagination. And so, third epic. Angel of Imagination opened his eyes. Before him was a familiar garden. Before being summoned to the future, he had been strolling in the garden with Adam. More precisely, Angel of Imagination was accompanying Adam to stake out Ancient Sun God because Ancient Sun God had a certain probability of appearing in this garden after finishing his affairs. So, when Adam was bored, he liked to come and stake out, occasionally bringing others along, such as him, or Medici and others. Oh, I forgot to ask Mr. Lucifer how Adam was doing. Last time, Saucerer mentioned that Adam seemed to have done many wrong things in the future and suffered many beatings. I wonder if he has corrected himself yet. Angel of Imagination's gaze fell upon Adam, who was a few steps away, and his thoughts inevitably drifted. "What are you looking at? What's wrong with you? Why did you suddenly start spacing out?" Adam naturally couldn't fail to notice Angel of Imagination's strangeness. He looked at him suspiciously and asked. Angel of Imagination hesitated for a moment, recalling Saucerer's instructions, and finally said, "Sorry, Adam, I suddenly have something to discuss with Saucerer. I can't accompany you any longer today." Looking for Saucerer, Adam raised his eyebrows. He scrutinized Angel of Imagination, then suddenly curved his lips into a smile and said, "Coincidentally, I also have something to discuss with him. Let's go together. What I need to discuss with Saucerer might not be convenient to tell you," Angel of Imagination refused as tactfully as possible. Both the matters of the future and the fact that the Son of God is essentially an incarnation of God are currently confidential to Adam, so it's naturally impossible for him to know. "What is there that I can't know?" Adam was displeased upon hearing this. He was inherently a mischievous child, highly mischievous since childhood. It was just that in his youth, with someone keeping him in check, he hadn't done anything truly heinous, but that didn't prevent him from possessing other traits characteristic of a mischievous child. Moreover, Adam also possessed the keenness expected of a Go-3 family member. At this moment, he narrowed his eyes unpleasantly, looked at Angel of Imagination, and said, "For a long time, I've felt like you all are hiding something from me. You, Sorcerer, even Father, you all seem to share a common secret. Brother, am I not a child of this family? What exactly is it that I can't know?" By the end, whether he was feigning it or genuinely feeling it, Adam's expression even held a hint of sadness, and his address for Angel of Imagination changed from Adam to brother. Angel of Imagination felt a bit of cold sweat at this moment. Undeniably, both Sun God himself and his incarnation genuinely loved Adam. It could be said that most of their few selfish desires were given to him. It was precisely because of this that, facing Adam's questioning, even as an observer, Angel of Imagination could tell that Adam wasn't as sad as he appeared, yet he still felt a twinge of reluctance, because Adam's sadness wasn't entirely feigned, at least there was a touch of truth to it. Adam was genuinely upset that the other members of this family shared a common secret from which he was excluded. "But I can neither tell you that your future self became a mischievous child and we fell, nor can I tell you that I'm not your brother but your father," Angel of Imagination mused bitterly to himself. Although also an incarnation of Sun God, perhaps considering that he was to live as the Son of God, Angel of Imagination's personality was actually slightly lively. It was probably Sun God who split his more lively side to Angel of Imagination. This makes it hard to imagine that he, who would merge with Sun God's divinity in the future, would become such an existence that, to put it nicely, is detached, and to put it bluntly, is like a machine. Divinity, Angel of Imagination almost subconsciously touched his face. Nothing was worn there, but Angel of Imagination could feel the mask worn over his soul. That mask had actually traveled through time with him from the future back to the present. "Sorry, Adam, I really have something very important to discuss with Sorcerer." Thinking of the main business, Angel of Imagination's heart, which had softened a bit, hardened again. He looked at Adam, then showed a comforting smile and said, "Of course you are a child of this family. It's just, Adam, you are still young, and some things truly cannot be told to you right now." After saying this, to prevent Adam from making a fuss, Angel of Imagination turned and left almost at the fastest speed. Adam, who was indeed planning to make a fuss but didn't get the chance. Adam took a deep breath, then another, his chest heaving, looking quite upset. Unlike the Adam of later generations, who no longer had the protection of Sun God and had struggled in the secular world for thousands of years, the Adam of this era was clearly more naive, and his emotions fluctuated more noticeably. "You are still young, hey, you're only a minute older than me." After a long while, perhaps having calmed down, Adam revealed a cold sneer, deciding to go back and steal Adam's favorite bottle of wine to give to Medici. After the latter had drunk most of it, he would then inform him to come over and let him witness firsthand how his favorite wine was finished. As Adam was about to lay hands on Angel of Imagination's prized possessions, on the other side, Angel of Imagination had already arrived at Sorcerer's study. Upon pushing open the study door, his first glance did not fall on Sorcerer himself, but rather on the mountain of piled parchment scrolls. Chapter 255, The Decision of the Fantasy Angel. It was only after the Angel of Imagination bypassed the parchment that he saw Sorcerer, who was looking at a document behind the desk. "What's wrong? Is something the matter?" Sorcerer instinctively offered a gentle smile. He looked up, and after seeing who had arrived, he paused, a little puzzled. Why would Adam come looking for him? The Angel of Imagination wasted no time in recounting what had just happened, and finally, he hesitated for a second before honestly saying, "Besides that, Mr. Lucifer also asked me when you plan to change jobs." Sorcerer was taken aback, then showed a wry smile and said, "He really is persistent." Sorcerer shook his head, saying nothing more about being poached. Instead, he looked at the Angel of Imagination and asked, "How do you feel now? That mask, do you think it can succeed?" "I'm not sure." The Angel of Imagination shook his head, then said, "However, it did give me some inspiration. Even if we truly cannot change history, perhaps we can make some effort to interfere with the future." Interfering with the future here naturally didn't refer to interfering with the future after being summoned to it, but rather to making arrangements to change certain events in Lucifer's era. "How do you intend to do that?" Sorcerer looked at him and asked. "Based on the characteristics of this mask, I will perform deep self-suggestion." The Angel of Imagination unhurriedly explained his operation. Simply put, it was to actively use various abilities of the spectator pathway to amplify his emotions on a psychological level to fit the mask's effect, thereby achieving the goal of retaining a sense of self in the future fusion. I am already the strongest spectator, and my humanity is still intact. Coupled with the power of this mask, the success rate will be very high. The Angel of Imagination smiled at this point and said, "Of course, if the Creator is willing to assist me, perhaps the success rate will be even higher. I will notify the Creator to return as soon as possible." Saussure nodded, expressing his affirmation of this plan. He then thought of something and hesitated, looking at the Angel of Imagination and saying, "The future Adam once mentioned this kind of mask to the Creator. When a certain emotion amplified by the mask reaches a certain level, the person wearing the mask will become Lucifer's puppet, but it seems they can break free through willpower. Even if they were both incarnations of the Creator, the information they knew differed due to their differing authority and status. After all, Saussure's and Adam's memories were not interconnected unless they deliberately exchanged them. As for why he specifically reminded him of this, it was obvious. Even though the Creator's faction and Roland were close allies now, in reality, both sides were wary of each other for various reasons. This wariness did not hinder their cooperation, but it was always necessary to maintain a degree of caution when needed. The Angel of Imagination heard this, looked at Saussure, and then gave a very energetic smile, saying, "Thanks for the reminder. Don't worry, I'm quite confident in my own will." And, the Angel of Imagination paused here, his tone becoming quiet. He looked at Saussure and softly said, "What's the difference between my future self and a puppet of divinity?" Saussure fell silent. He sighed and said, "You're right. There's really no difference between a robot and a puppet. So cheer up, Saussure. If this plan succeeds, I might regain consciousness earlier than your future self." The Angel of Imagination looked at Saussure and smiled. "I look forward to it." Saussure then also showed a gentle smile. Adam watched the past Angel of Imagination disappear, showing no expression of loss. He remained in his usual indifferent state. However, the next second, as if a delayed reaction, Adam's expression finally changed, appearing to be in pain, yet also bewildered. Adam's body swayed, causing him to almost instinctively reach out and steady himself on a nearby chair. His other hand rose to cover his face, obscuring his expression. Clearly, Adam's reaction this time was much greater than Ask's reaction after Death Consul wore the mask and went back last time. This was not surprising. Among the two individuals, Death Consul and Ask, Death Consul was the one with more indifferent emotions, while Ask's humanity was quite abundant. Therefore, when the emotions accumulated by Death Consul wearing the mask acted upon Ask, the effect did not seem very obvious. Just like a person who can inherently score 80 points, even if they add 5 points, it's still the same. But the samples of Adam and the Angel of Imagination were exactly the opposite. Adam was the one with indifferent humanity, while the Angel of Imagination's humanity was much more abundant. Coupled with the Angel of Imagination's various efforts to maximize the mask's effect, it was not surprising to have such a reaction. Roland looked at Adam with interest. Through the gaps between his fingers, he could see coldness occasionally flashing in Adam's golden eyes, and at other times, the gentleness that had once appeared in the Angel of Imagination's eyes. Two similar yet different individuals seemed to be undergoing some degree of fusion at this moment. Undoubtedly, the humanity that once belonged to the Angel of Imagination had revived within Adam at this moment. It was hard to say how much had revived, but at least Adam's humanity was no longer zero at this moment. "Mr. Adam, are you all right?" Klein looked at Adam's behavior, which was clearly a manifestation of personality split. He hesitated, then asked with a slight hint of concern. Mainly, personality split was quite dangerous in the Beander domain, easily leading to loss of control. "You should trust the will of a savior, and at the very least, you can trust my mask." Roland glanced at him and said with a smile. He was not really worried. As a professional in a sense, Roland could see that Adam's current state was actually not bad. In fact, it could be described as improving. It was just like how patients often experience some pain before getting better. For an emotionless machine like Adam, regaining humanity naturally required some struggle. Upon hearing this, Klein first felt a little guilty, then breathed a sigh of relief, and continued to curiously observe Adam. He was actually quite curious about what kind of existence this divine incarnation of the sun god would become after regaining humanity. Neither of them spoke for the next period of time, and the church became quiet for a while. But this quietness did not last too long, because Adam's transformation did not take much time. After about a few minutes, the blond priest stood up straight again, tidied his slightly disheveled clothes, restoring himself to his previous dignified appearance. Then Adam looked at Roland and Klein, showing a slightly apologetic smile, and said, "I'm very sorry to have kept you waiting." Chapter 256, The Birth of Adam 2.0. Who are you now, Adam or Angel of Imagination? Roland naturally didn't mind the short waiting time, only looking at Adam and asking with great interest. What's the difference between the two? Adam retorted, then showed a faint smile and said, I guess I'm still Adam now, but the humanity belonging to Angel of Imagination has indeed revived within my body. So, is this a success or a failure? Roland asked, pinching his chin. If you wanted to see the former Angel of Imagination resurrected, then it's probably a failure. But if you just wanted to see an Adam with a self, then this has indeed succeeded. Adam paused here. He probably thought of something, and suddenly sighed. He made a gesture of prayer and said, This humanity is questioning me, questioning everything I've done in the past. I still don't regret my past actions, but if I had to do it again, I would probably choose a gentler approach. Roland raised an eyebrow upon hearing this. He could tell that the current Adam was indeed a comprehensive version of the machine-like Adam in Angel of Imagination. He wasn't as cold as the machine-like Adam, but he also lacked the vitality and abundant emotions of Angel of Imagination. However, since it was just a trial plan, Roland was already very satisfied that it could reach this level. So, he smiled and said, Then will you apologize? Adam's movements paused. He tilted his head and looked in a certain direction outside the small chapel. He didn't know what he thought of, before he said softly. He probably won't need my apology. Then will you apologize? Roland did not deny his words, but smiled and asked again. As for the target of his apology, it naturally referred to Medici, who had been cooked into hot pot by Adam. Roland didn't care about other people who had been tricked by Adam. He wasn't some truly overly sympathetic guy, so of course, he only cared about the people he cared about. Adam finally turned his head to look at Roland. The golden eyes were no longer placid, but held a very faint, yet extremely complex emotion, like a sigh, like pain, and like helplessness. He looked at Roland and said, I will go find him. So Roland smiled. He suddenly thought of something again and asked, Then let me ask you, Mr. Adam, are you now trying to save this world out of self-interest, out of obsession, or out of your heart? Adam was silent for a while before saying, I don't know. I once wanted to save this world because it was the only goal the sun god left me, and the only meaning of my existence in this world. And now, Adam paused here. He lowered his eyes, still looking compassionate, but unlike the previous falseness, this time Adam seemed a little more real. I still exist for this, but I suddenly realized that it's not just humanity as a whole that needs to be saved, but also every individual among those 1,000 faces. Now you finally look a bit more human. Perhaps I should open a new chapter for you in my script. Roland smiled. Then, a camera suddenly appeared in his hand, and he aimed it at Adam, taking a flurry of photos. As the latter looked over with a slight surprise, Roland smiled at him and said, I'm used to taking photos at important moments as a memento. You don't mind, do you? What else could Adam say? He couldn't possibly rush over to snatch the camera from Roland's hand and smash it, so he could only smile and say, You may do as you please. Meanwhile, at a certain Aurora Order outpost in Backland, Roland, currently in Jack's disguise, was helping Medici sort through intelligence, primarily identifying various recyclable talents within the numinous episcopate and considering how to utilize them later. He suddenly looked up at Medici, who was reading a report next to him, and showed a bright smile. Medici, even while reading intelligence, would always use the corner of his eye to check his surroundings. He instantly noticed the change in Roland's expression. He immediately raised an eyebrow, looked back at him, and showed a look of disdain, saying, What bad idea are you cooking up now? As far as Medici knew, the more brilliant Roland smiled, the more likely someone was going to be unlucky. I'm not cooking up any bad ideas. I just did something good, Roland said with a grin, then stared directly at Medici without speaking. Medici felt a chill down his spine from being stared at. He almost subconsciously checked himself all over. After confirming there were no issues, he irritably grabbed a nearby crumpled paper ball and threw it over, saying, "Stop smiling. What exactly do you want? Can you just say it?" His smile was giving him goosebumps. All right, as you wish." Roland shook his head, looking helpless, then smiled and said, "I just went to see Adam." Huh. Medici perked up upon hearing this. He finally became serious and looked at Roland, asking, "What kind of deal did you make with him again?" "It's not exactly a deal, you could say I gave him a small gift." Sigh, thinking about it this way, I lost out big time. I should have extorted him first. Roland looked heartbroken. Of course, Roland didn't really feel like he lost. After all, a debt of gratitude is also a debt, and moreover, enabling Adam to possess humanity was in itself a good thing for Roland's side. "Get to the point, what did you give him?" Medici didn't believe Roland would truly lose out. He knew the other party's methods well. He might not make a huge profit, but he would definitely not lose money. "I gave him a persona mask." Roland no longer kept him in suspense and quickly recounted what had just happened, of course, without mentioning the apology. So it succeeded. Even Medici was surprised at this moment, completely unexpected that Roland would suddenly pull off such a major event. At least the current Adam indeed possesses a trace of humanity. It definitely can't compare to the former Angel of Imagination, but it can only be said to be a good start. After the humanity belonging to Angel of Imagination is reactivated, as long as Adam isn't an idiot, he will inevitably strengthen this humanity later, Roland said, spreading his hands. It's well known that humanity can be strengthened. The former Adam was purely like a clever housewife who couldn't cook without rice. He had no humanity, so he couldn't strengthen it. And the trace of emotion that the persona mask previously brought to Adam was, after all, an external object created out of nothing, difficult to increase through normal anchors. But now it's different. Although the humanity Adam currently possesses is still preserved because of the mask, it truly belongs to the former Angel of Imagination and is no longer purely an external object. This humanity can theoretically be further revived as anchors increase. Chapter 257 Zhao Hong, Unforgivable. This is truly, tisk. Medici clicked his tongue, his expression at this moment quite complex, seemingly resentful, yet also relieved, and perhaps even a little mocking and at a loss. Medici then closed his eyes. After a few seconds, when he opened his ruby-like eyes again, the emotions in them had returned to normal. Medici looked at Roland and, uncharacteristically, praised him. "You actually did something decent for once." "What do you mean, for once? Haven't I done enough decent things?" Roland immediately looked at him, displeased, and retorted, "Putting everything else aside, I was the one who fished you out. Is that how you talk to your benefactor?" "Of course, I am very grateful to my benefactor, but for a boss who made me work 240 hours of overtime continuously, not stabbing him directly is already me being soft-hearted." Medici curled his lips into a mocking smile, looking at Roland and saying, "It's a good thing I'm considered a spirit world creature now, otherwise, I might have been the first angel in this world to die from overwork." Cough. Roland was uncharacteristically flustered for a moment, looking left and right, then finally muttering softly, "That's why I asked for compensation for you." "What compensation?" Medici asked him suspiciously. "It's like this, I just had a chat with Adam 2.0, and we talked about you." Roland smiled as he looked at him, and said, "So he decided to apologize to you." Medici's pupils constricted at that moment. He almost instinctively took half a step back, stopping only when he hit the chair behind him, looking at Roland in astonishment, and said, "Apology. After all, he made a mistake. It was fine when he was an AI, but now that he has humanity, of course he has to apologize." Roland said matter-of-factly, then seemed to remember something, looked at Medici, and very solemnly added, "Of course, I know you're a sun god fanatic, and you'll definitely forgive him as soon as he apologizes, but you have to remember, you're my tool now, and you can't switch jobs." Huh. Hearing this, Medici almost couldn't help but let out a laugh, whether from anger or something else. He then glanced at Roland, and then, pulling an apple from who knows where, took a big bite. Crunch. Medici was chewing the apple when he suddenly felt his arm being nudged. He turned his head to find Roland looking at him, making a gesture to ask for something. I've been helping you sort through these documents for so long, I'm starving. Give me one too, Roland said with righteous indignation. Tisk, I hope you starve to death. Medici scoffed, then pulled another apple from under the table and threw it to Roland. So, there were two people munching on apples in the study. After Medici finished his apple, he pulled out a cigarette from who knows where, lit it, and put it in his mouth. After taking a deep drag of strong mint flavor, Medici suddenly choked, coughed a few times, and seemed to curse under his breath before looking at Roland and saying, annoyed, when did you change my cigarettes here too? Of course, when I came. After all, I don't have a hobby of inhaling secondhand smoke. Roland spread his hands, looked at Medici, and then earnestly said, Little Red, you should know that smoking is harmful to your health. Be careful of lung cancer. Hey, although Medici didn't know what lung cancer was, he could roughly guess what it was about. He sneered but didn't put out the mint cigarette in his hand. Instead, he took another puff before looking at Roland and saying, I'm sorry, if I die early, it will definitely be from overwork while working for you. There's absolutely no other possibility. Roland then lowered his head, feeling guilty again. Medici continued to smoke the mint cigarette. When it was half burnt, he suddenly said, I won't forgive him. Roland turned his head to look at him. No matter what, the betrayal is a fact. I understand why he did what he did back then. Perhaps it was truly because he had no emotions, so he chose the ruthless approach that best suited his interests. Medici didn't continue smoking. He just held the cigarette between his fingers, letting the white smoke drift upwards, obscuring his expression. Now he has emotions, he has humanity, perhaps he has realized the error of his past actions, perhaps he truly feels apologetic towards me. Medici continued, but what does that matter? Does his apology mean that everything that happened no longer exists? Medici suddenly showed a mocking smile, not knowing whom he was mocking. I am not a very magnanimous person. I cannot just wipe everything away with an apology. Roland listened quietly. He looked at Medici, thought for a moment, and then spoke, but you also no longer harbor murderous intent towards him, or perhaps, you never did. Medici's movements paused. He finally extinguished the mint cigarette in his hand. Then he glanced at Roland, his entire being as sharp as a newly unsheathed sword, and said, if you have something to say, say more. Don't be angry, Little Red, this is no big deal. Isn't it just a case of love-hate, unable to let go? It's very normal. I've seen this kind of emotion many times. For example, a certain famous Gotham Daddy Issues king, Mr. Red Hood, probably has a lot in common with you. Roland wasn't afraid of him and said with a grin. Who? Medici glanced at him, signaling him to elaborate. Roland immediately began to educate him about the famous Batman family's love-hate saga. After listening for a bit, Medici suddenly said, this Batman you mentioned, he adopted a group of children, and even before they were adults, he made them wear tight suits and took them to fight crime. Is he really a decent person? Although Medici was a natural mythical creature, due to Saussre's teachings, Medici's moral compass was, in a sense, quite upright. Why don't you look at yourself, and then look at Sun God? Roland smiled as he looked at him. Medici suddenly fell silent. Batman took minors to fight crime in tight suits, while many of the ancient sun gods' 8 king of angels were also taken in by him from a young age, and each was even given a special effect wing. It is well known that normal angels in the Lord of Mysteries world do not have wings, but the 8 king of angels all do, so how those wings came to be is obvious. So you see, I told you you have a lot in common. Roland spread his hands, saying with righteous indignation. Medici glanced at him, his gaze gradually becoming dangerous. Don't look like you're going to beat up your boss is working 2 jobs right now. I'm very busy, okay. Roland said, finally feeling justified in this matter. He then looked at Medici and asked, so, how do you plan to deal with Adam now? Of course, I'll beat him up, then hang him on a lamppost. Medici glanced at him, repeating Roland's previous idea, then curled his lips and said, originally, he had no humanity at all, and I even thought that doing so wouldn't have any effect on him, but now. Since he now had humanity, he should also possess the appropriate sense of shame. Roland blinked, then said enthusiastically, "How about I drag Amon to form a band and play music next to him then?" Chapter 258 Adam's Shame. How about I drag Amon along to form a band and play some music then? Hearing Roland's words, Medici glanced at him, picturing the scene in his mind, and the smile on his lips became even more unrestrained. He then slowly said, "Remember to take pictures." Of course, how could I miss Adam's dark history? Roland had an expression that said, "Do I really need you to remind me?" He then enthusiastically discussed various schemes to persecute Adam with Medici for a while, before yawning and saying, a little drowsily, "So sleepy, no, I need to catch up on sleep." No matter how profound Roland's spirituality was, he couldn't withstand the consecutive summons from the Death Consul and the Angel of Imagination. Although his spirituality hadn't been completely exhausted yet, it was close enough, so he naturally felt sleepy. Medici glanced at him, pointed to the left, and said, "The third room on the left after you exit is the guest room. If you need anything, just ask someone from the Aurora Order." "Okay, okay." Roland gave Medici an okay gesture, yawning as he walked towards the door. Just as he was about to leave, he seemed to remember something, paused, turned back to look at Medici, and cautioned, "Don't fight with Adam. I don't have the energy to support you right now." Upon hearing this, Medici almost rolled his eyes, and said irritably, "In your eyes, am I a powder keg that explodes at the slightest provocation? If I were really that impulsive, I would have fought him long ago." At this point, a hint of self-mockery appeared on Medici's lips, and he said, "Don't worry, I understand what it means to endure better than you." Roland glanced at him but didn't say anything else. He was truly sleepy, so he waved at Medici and went to the next room to catch up on sleep. Click. As the door closed, Medici was the only one left in the study. He didn't speak, just stood there. Medici's gaze seemed to fall on the intelligence reports on the table, but a closer look would reveal that his pupils were unfocused, clearly indicating he was in a daze. Tisk. Medici suddenly let out an annoyed click of his tongue. He then pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a drag. A faint minty flavor spread in his mouth, making Medici's mind even clearer. Medici stood there, smoking one mint cigarette after another, and soon his supply was running low. "This stuff is quite addictive," Medici suddenly said, unsure if it was a compliment or an insult. With the last mint leaf between his fingers, he suddenly looked up in a certain direction, then a mocking smile appeared on his lips, and he said, "What, even though you know I won't forgive you, you're still preparing to apologize to me?" The blonde priest appeared silently opposite Medici. His gaze swept over the cigarette butts scattered on the floor in front of Medici, and he frowned slightly, saying, "You should throw cigarette butts into an ashtray. This is too dirty." Medici's movement paused. The mint cigarette between his fingers deformed at that moment from the force. Medici looked up, staring intently at Adam in front of him, and suddenly let out a laugh. "Huh. What should I call you now, Angel of Imagination? Sun God? Or Adam? They are all me, in the end." Adam's golden eyes looked at him, his expression at that moment seemed to sigh, "You clearly know this, don't you? That's why you're so, in pain, Medici." "Enough." Medici's expression grew very cold, like a hedgehog bristling with defenses after being poked in its soft underbelly. He looked at Adam, his expression then turning mocking, and said, "Sometimes I truly feel that I should learn from Amon." Regarding whether true creator, Adam, and other beings were equivalent to the sun god, Amon and Medici had different attitudes. Simply put, Amon refused to acknowledge any father other than the original sun god. In Amon's eyes, if the father content wasn't 100%, it was fake. "I don't mind you treating me like Amon treats me," Adam replied frankly, his golden eyes gazing at Medici, seemingly with a hint of warmth, "if that can bring you relief." "You're still like this, huh?" Medici suddenly laughed. He looked at Adam, meeting his eyes. "I was wondering how much you would change after gaining humanity, but you're still the same. From a purely divine puppet, you've become a puppet with a bit of warmth." Adam did not refute his words, but merely looked at him quietly, with a hint of sadness and a sigh in his golden eyes. He suddenly spoke, "I am very sorry, Medici. In the fourth epoch, I betrayed you, hurt you, I betrayed your trust, and I betrayed your loyalty." Medici froze. Even though he was mentally prepared, he still froze when he actually heard the apology. Then Medici didn't know what was wrong with him, he just couldn't control himself and started to laugh, louder and louder, until his whole body was trembling. Adam still watched him quietly, without saying a word. Under such a gaze, Medici quietly stopped laughing. He suddenly became expressionless, as if all his emotions had been exhausted in the previous burst of laughter. Medici looked up at Adam and said, "All right, I've heard your apology, now what? Do you hope I forgive you? I don't need you to forgive me." Adam shook his head. He looked at Medici and said, "I just hope this makes you feel a little better. My humanity wishes for this. If you really want to make me feel better, sure, let me stab you, then hang you on a lamppost, with a sign next to it that says open black lens bracket this is a necessary sacrifice close black lens bracket." Medici remained expressionless. He looked at Adam, repeating the plan he had discussed with Roland earlier. "Amon will provide background music for you. Which song do you like? How about a funeral dirge?" Adam listened to his words, lowered his eyes, his expression not surprised, but he also didn't immediately agree. "It seems our great Mr. Adam also has a sense of shame." Medici finally lost his expressionless demeanor. He scoffed, then pulled out an apple from somewhere and took a bite, the force as if he were biting off someone's flesh. Adam looked up at him, then seemed to sigh helplessly, and then said, "The first part is fine, the latter part is not." Medici raised an eyebrow. He looked at Adam, understood his words, and said, slightly incredulously, "You really do have a sense of shame." Medici understood that Adam meant being stabbed was acceptable, but being hung on a lamppost, having a sign, and having Amon provide music were not. Chapter 259, Really Stabbed. Is it strange that I already possess humanity? Adam glanced indifferently at Medici, paused, and then added, "Of course, if one day you can defeat me, you can naturally do so. Then you'd better wait for that day." Medici gritted his teeth. He understood Adam's unspoken meaning. It was a tacit permission to retaliate against him once he was strong enough. "I look forward to it." Adam showed a faint smile. The room fell silent again. Medici took a few more bites of the apple, then suddenly looked at Adam and said, "Why aren't you leaving yet?" Adam looked at him, then said softly, "Aren't you going to stab me? What, do you need me to provide the knife for you?" Medici's movements paused. He looked at Adam, then smiled, and approached him while biting his apple. When their bodies were close enough, a dagger finally appeared in Medici's hand. While still biting his apple, he plunged the dagger into Adam's abdomen, even twisting it, then pulled the dagger out. Blood instantly gushed from the wound. Adam groaned, covering his abdomen with one hand, while he met Medici's gaze and said softly, "Happy. Very satisfying." Medici uttered a single word, then turned around and returned to his seat. He casually threw the apple core he had finished eating into the trash can and stuck the blood-stained dagger onto the table. "Medici, you should work well with Roland. Although he may not be human, he treats his friends better than many true humans." Adam's voice sounded again. "I don't need you to remind me," Medici said without lifting his head. Adam glanced at Medici, seemed to shake his head, then his figure vanished, leaving only one sentence. "The cigarette butts on the ground need to be cleaned up." Medici scoffed when he heard this, then gazed at the blood-stained dagger. He suddenly sighed and said softly, "We are even." From then on, he would no longer hate Adam. Although Medici would still target him, it would only be because he simply found Adam displeasing. He would no longer be trapped by that past. It's over. Thankfully they didn't fight. Roland, in the next room, yawned. He had originally gone to catch up on sleep, but his gossip radar went off halfway through his nap, and when he got up, he found that Adam had indeed arrived. So Roland endured his sleepiness and forced himself to finish watching the drama unfold. It's hard to say whether this was due to Roland's concern for Medici or a gossip lover's desire to witness the gossip. Perhaps it was both. After all, Roland genuinely cared about his friends and truly had a heart that loved gossip. That's good. This way, Medici can also move on. Roland shook his head, then said with a slight regret, "What a pity for all that blood. It's the blood of an king of angels after all." Despite the pity, Roland naturally wouldn't go into the study to collect the divine blood that might have spilled on the ground, so he just sighed briefly and went back to catch up on sleep. Ask naturally didn't know what was happening with his roommates while he was diligently preparing for tomorrow's parent-child time plan. If he had known, he would probably have sighed, expressed his feelings, and patted Medici on the shoulder, telling him to look forward. After all, who doesn't have a troubled past? Unfortunately, Ask didn't know, so he happily prepared the outing plan and, due to anticipation, suffered from insomnia, staying awake all night until the next day. Fortunately, for a Sequence 2 death console, staying up all night was naturally no problem. When he saw his child the next day, Ask still looked radiant. Thus, Ask had a perfect parent-child time, and even his humanity, which had been somewhat unstable due to the recent integration of his past, became indestructible again. After spending time with his child, Ask saw that everyone in the house was busy. Naturally, he didn't want to be idle, so he volunteered to help Medici, and thus, another angel joined the Aurora Order's base. Time passed in this manner, and in a blink of an eye, it was the day Roland planned to take action against the numinous episcopate. During this period, the internal factional struggle within the numinous episcopate has reached a white-hot stage. Pale Empress Shaw, unwilling to submit to the death impersonated by Ask, has been recalling royal faction members scattered outside. Roland, wearing his Lucifer persona, said while pointing on the map. Coupled with Hurtle recalling artificial death members in accordance with Ask's decree, over half of the numinous episcopate's members are currently concentrated here, almost encompassing all of the numinous episcopate's middle and high-ranking officials. So as long as we take this place, the remaining scattered numinous episcopate members will naturally not be a concern, and we also have the death console as insurance, which can minimize the appearance of chaos. Speaking of this, Roland, wearing his Lucifer persona, looked up at Ask and said, "Ask, you are responsible for the numinous episcopate members in this area." Ask, who was listening intently, looked at the area Roland pointed to, then nodded and said, "Okay. Medici, I don't think I need to tell you, do I?" Roland then looked at Medici, smiling. "As long as you can deal with Shia, I can naturally handle the remaining royal faction members." Medici sat with his legs crossed, a mint cigarette dangling from his mouth, looking like a lord. Roland then nodded, his gaze turning to Will, and he smiled. "Well, could I ask you to be an insurance?" Although this operation was practically foolproof, necessary caution was still required, and a snake of fate who could bring good luck and reset time within an area could clearly maximize the recovery of results in case of an accident. "No problem, but I want ice cream, the kind Jack makes himself, for a whole month." Will nodded, then stated his demand. "No, what does that have to do with me?" The Jack Jones, next to him complained, "If anyone should make ice cream, it should be teacher." Roland, wearing his Lucifer persona, looked at Will and smiled, "At most a week. If you eat ice cream, little Amon will also want to eat it. Although he has grown a lot now, eating too much can still make him sick. Cough, I really was still little back then, I won't eat that much now." Little Amon coughed, speaking with a bit of embarrassment. He now looked like an adult, though his face was still slightly youthful. Chapter 260 Action begins. "You even finished half a can of honey yesterday and had an upset stomach all night because of it," Roland stated a fact indifferently, glancing at him. "Ah, that was an accident, really an accident. I just wanted to taste it," and then, little Amon's face turned red, and he quickly tried to defend himself, but he couldn't think of a suitable excuse for a while, so he stammered. "Whether it was an accident or not, it shows that your self-control hasn't changed from when you were little, and of course, neither has your physical condition," Roland said with a smile, looking at little Amon. Little Amon clearly couldn't refute Roland's words. After stammering for a long time, he finally mumbled, "I've only been born for a little over 10 days. So you're still a child. Children should act like children. Don't get involved in adult matters, be good." Roland reached out and ruffled little Amon's hair. After sending him away, he looked at Will, waiting for his answer. "A week is too short, it should be at least 20 days. Will grumbled discontentedly. 10 days, Roland said with a smile, looking at him. "Half a month," Will offered again. 7 days, Roland said without batting an eye. "No, how can it go back to the starting point?" Will looked at him in confusion, then probably fearing that he would offer less and less, he quickly said, 10 days it is, but I get to choose the flavor." "All right," Roland nodded with satisfaction. He wasn't really worried about little Amon getting sick from eating ice cream or unwilling to make ice cream. He just purely enjoyed the pleasure of bargaining with someone. It might sound a bit boring, but Roland was just that kind of boring person. Wait, isn't anyone going to listen to me? Am I not the one making the ice cream? Jack Jones spoke again. Sorry, Jack, your teacher sold you to me. Although knowing the true nature of Jack Jones, is a professional actor who plays whatever age he restarts to, Will chose to respect his ally's interests and hobbies, cooperating well. Roland, who was wearing the Lucifer persona, glanced at Jack Jones, and said with a smile, "You've grown up, it's time to do something serious. Don't hang out with your scoundrel friends all day." But making ice cream isn't serious business either. Jack Jones mumbled discontentedly. Klein, who was next to him, looked down at his teacup, feeling at that moment that this teacup was truly a teacup. After all, if he, as a scoundrel friend, were to speak at this moment, he would surely attract all the firepower. After arranging all the adults in the family, Roland finally looked at the three little ones. After thinking for a few seconds, he instructed, "You three will also go along this time to broaden your horizons, especially you, Jack. Klein will soon be able to advance to Faceless. What about you? When will you be able to become a Faceless? Hurry, hurry, all you know is to rush. Advancement is very difficult, you know. Not everyone has cheats," Jack Jones muttered under his breath, but deep down, he felt a bit of anticipation and curiosity. Roland was mainly curious whether a persona like Jack Jones could advance like a normal person. If not, what would happen after taking the potion? Roland wasn't afraid of blowing up the persona. A low-sequence persona, creating another one, wasn't a difficult task for him. Roland, who was wearing the Lucifer persona, then thought of himself. He looked at Klein and said with a smile, "After this numinous episcopate operation ends, you should be able to advance to Faceless. Are you ready?" Seeing Lucifer mention him, Klein immediately perked up, nodded, and said, "I'm ready, whether it's to advance to Faceless or to go there." "Very good, I look forward to your performance then," Roland nodded and said with a smile. "What about me? Doesn't Uncle Lucifer have anything to say to me?" Little Amon raised his hand at this moment, then rubbed his hands with a bit of anticipation, looking at Lucifer and saying, "Actually, I also want to go to that place with Klein." Little Amon had always heard Roland and others talk about that place and knew that most of his family members were involved in the reform. As possibly the only one in the family who hadn't participated, he had naturally been anxious for a long time. "You?" Roland raised an eyebrow. He suddenly smiled, then nodded, saying meaningfully, "All right, then you can go with Klein. I will arrange an identity for you." "Thank you, Uncle Lucifer." Little Amon's eyes immediately lit up. "Don't thank me. I just hope you gain some insight then." Roland looked at him and said with a smile, "Little Amon, we all hope you can gain humanity, true humanity." Little Amon was stunned, looking somewhat bewildered. Roland just smiled and said nothing more. Does Little Amon possess humanity? From his daily behavior, he seems no different from ordinary people. He cries, makes a fuss, gets sick, has people he likes, and people he dislikes. From this perspective, Little Amon does possess humanity, at least some emotions. This is normal, after all, Amon himself also has special humanity. No matter how despicable he is, he still has deep affection for his father. But besides that, Little Amon still didn't have much affection for mortals, still lacked empathy. At his core, he was still a high and mighty time angel. Of course, Roland could understand this. A seedling that had already been crooked from the root wasn't that easy to straighten. It naturally had to be done slowly. Roland wasn't really hoping that Little Amon would turn into a righteous person tomorrow. He just hoped that Little Amon could possess the most basic empathy and bottom line, knowing what to do, what not to do, and what was permissible. It could be said that Roland's requirements for Little Amon were actually very low. And after arranging everyone in the family, big and small, Roland took out his pocket watch, checked the time, then stood up and said with a smile, "Time's up, let's go." Shia's eyelids twitched violently. In this world, there was originally no saying that a twitching left eye meant wealth and a twitching right eye meant disaster. This was a mystical knowledge brought by a famous great emperor, which had always been scorned by the big shots in the mystical field. Shia was naturally one of them. She pressed her hand on her right eye, only feeling that these days were becoming increasingly troublesome. Since the last divine punishment incident, the numinous episcopate's attitude towards the returning, death, had undergone a drastic shift. Not only did members of various small factions who were originally hesitant and wavering panic and defect to the artificial death faction overnight, revering the new rules they had once scorned as treasures, but even the royal faction itself became uneasy. Shia had been utterly exhausted trying to appease the wavering morale within the royal faction during this period. Whether by coercion or enticement, she had used every method, but basically, this only restored superficial stability to the royal faction. Internally, there was still too much instability. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.